So, still learning how to do this thing.
Uh, how the
New method.
fuck does environmentalism and religion intersect? Unless you're one of the people who think we're getting raptured within a few years anyway, and consequently that long-term environmental issues don't matter.
I love that question so much. And the reason I love that question so much, I can't help but think I had a similar reaction at first when I started thinking about this project many years
Mm-hmm.
ago. I thought to myself, um, if I inhabit a space, a religious space, where I'm gonna, yeah, any day I'm gonna be raptured, where what really matters is what's coming next, and that
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of be at the train station for the good stuff to happen. Why would I be worried about the environment around me? Wouldn't that be at best a distraction? And so I kind of theorized early on that maybe what was going to happen was, um, religion would have this adversarial, particularly Christianity would have this adversarial relationship to environmental concern. Uh, Definitely thought that might be the case. What I found was very different from that as I started to dig in, but there was definitely something there that, yeah, I had the same reaction at first. And it animated some of the questions that I asked, and I definitely found some things that surprised me.
But what was your biggest surprise? Then, like, what was the? Because that was my
Um,
feeling too. By the way, like that was like Humsadu's question too. Like, I think that's natural.
Well, wait a second. I think Marcus wanted to jump in. Do we want to
Do we
start
start?
now?
Do we
And
start?
introduce our
Yeah,
guest?
And
here. Let me let me add Gremlo. Get him in here. Let me go
we're
into his
itching.
chat real
We're
quick.
itching.
I love the energy tonight, man. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a like a. I don't want to say like unusual because that almost has a negative connotation, but it's not typically something you really think about, and I think that's what's going to make the episode a particularly good one.
So let me do the let me introduce our guest here just a little bit. So this is Dr. Lucas Schroet, who I'm well acquainted with. He's contributed to several of my projects. He got his degree at the University of Kansas, and his last couple years were my first couple years at a position I had there before moving on to better things. But one of the things that you wouldn't know unless you knew him is that he went to University of Texas at Arlington and studied with one of the great contemporary critical theorists, Ben Agger, and he was Ben Agger's last student. And why I bring this up is because it relates to a thing that we've talked about a lot in here, which is his book was titled Public Sociology, and so he was kind of one of the first advocates for like the public scholar. So
Interesting.
anyway, that's our guest, and I just can't wait to hear about his project.
Thanks.
Yeah,
It's great to be
likewise.
here. Appreciate the introduction. Um, this is my first attendance at Ministry of Science. Again, happy to be here. I'm not really sure how the format works, how you want to proceed. If you want me to chat a little bit, if I'm gonna open forum this, answer some questions. However, we're going to approach this, I'm happy to do.
Yeah, so I think once we get one of our other I guess we could call him both colleague and comrade. Once we get him in here, then we'll probably have you sort of give like a pretty big, or I guess broad rather, overview of what you do, and then I think we'll just kind of like pick your brain from there on out. So I think the format's a lot more dialectic. We typically make it such that it's not simply just you like talking into the void. Like it's in some capacity we've kind of looked into a little bit like what you do, and I know Greg especially has like a lot of questions I think in the back of his head, so we tend to, I guess, do our research, so to speak.
Oh no, don't say that word.
Hey, okay, now we're
Oh, I don't
I
think
see
we're
a Gremlo.
Doing a hippy dippy debate? Is that what we're throwing down? Oh, we're watching anime
What?
now. Okay, I'm all over the place.
we're listening to the City Pop while I was getting everything set up.
Fair enough. I actually probably need
Let's
to grab your
see.
frame.
We just fix this real quick. Maybe we can just do the panel.
Yeah, don't worry, I'm also in a perpetual state of scuffed overlays, so don't feel bad.
So this is my new toy that I got.
Standing desk?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Power.
Nice, dude.
Yo.
Congrats. That's a big
This is
one.
the academic bourgeois decadence that Lenin talked about.
Yes, it is.
That's what it is. Dude, and it's motorized. That's the $500 model. That's not the
No. This was like on sale $100 from Woot.com.
Oh,
Shut up.
dang. Wow.
Wheeling and dealing.
I might need you to send me a link to that
Yeah.
in Discord.
That's
They're
legit.
gone.
I need
They're
one.
gone.
Oh, they're gone?
Hey, for when they restock,
Yeah.
I'll sign up for the email notifications.
I just do the
gotta
perma
steal.
standing desk.
Greg,
Yeah.
you've been making waves in the Twitch poll space, by the way.
Oh shit, dude! I'm actually really yeah, dude. I didn't. I mean, I saw Haas's remarks on Twitter, so I was like reached out. I mean, anyone wants to make talk about DNA, I'm there, and so that was funny. And then yeah, watching your stream and then watching Rhizome too. I was tuning into Rhizome, and then he was like, "Oh, I was going to talk about that," and I was like, "What?" that was
There
that
you
was
go.
nuts, dude.
So let's
Good on you.
Let's talk about that during second half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But God damn it, I don't have a copy of your book. I'm going to spam chat with a link to it. So why don't you just give us like the for those who haven't read your book, the kind of Cliff Notes version of your study, what it is you did, and then we can kind of go down the rabbit hole with questions.
Sounds great to me. So I guess I'll start by talking about how I got into this. It seems like a really strange thing to connect together, right? Religion and environment. This really started in 2016. I was working with Bob Antonio at the University of Kansas, who's a big environmental sociologist. And I have this long-standing interest in religion. So the pieces were sort of already in place when I was a graduate student to do this kind of work. I was raised Catholic. I'm culturally Catholic at this point. I think it would be fair to say I don't practice anymore. But I read Laudato Si when Pope Francis issued this, partly because there was so much hate mail that came out of sort of the political right surrounding Laudato Si. This basically climate change encyclical in 2015. The Pope is saying, "Hey, look, we have to hear the cry of the earth," and he's using this language that's really evocative and that's really powerful, and there was a lot of controversy surrounding this, not only in the Catholic Church, but in a lot of sort of political circles that are proximate to it. And it made me really interested in this topic again. And this turned into a project that became a dissertation that became a book later on, basically. So I thought I was going to find certain things out about this religion environment connection. That was really the first foray into, wow, maybe it isn't what I thought it was. If people are looking for the end of the world, waiting for the end of the world to happen, if religion is focused on otherworldly salvation, why would it be interested in environmental concern, right? And the way I looked at Christianity in the United States, historically and into the present, the more diverse, the more nuanced that picture really started to look. I couldn't help but think that environmental change is something we're starting to see, right? It's not an abstraction. It's not a statistical model anymore. All you have to do is spend a little time outside year after year, and you can really start to see this happening. It's kind of in your face. Whether people are in denial about climate change or not, they can go outside. They can tell something's different over the last 30 years or so, and we can see the transformation. We can see this happening in front of us. And really the question is, how do we make sense of that transformation as it becomes more real, as it becomes more obvious? And because that transformation has these sort of moral components to it that deal with our worldview, that deal with our culture, I kept thinking, well, maybe religion's a great place to start thinking about that, to start thinking about culture, to start thinking about civil society, to start thinking about some of these bigger, not bigger, I should say smaller and more diffuse arenas in which people might address environmental issues. Environmental issues are often addressed at the level of policy, national policy, international policy. They're addressed through sort of technocratic means. We talk about economic change. We talk about some of these big sort of ideas. And I'm not denying the importance of that, but there's probably another story to tell here. And I started to pick through that and figure out what that story was. So even if you're going to argue, for example, that religion causes anything, right? That religion causes any kind of human behavior, there's a lot of myths surrounding what that means and what that looks like. But one of the big ones that comes to mind is we don't practice what we preach, right? Which is true, regardless of whether we're talking about religion or something else. We have a tendency to say one thing and do another as human beings. Honestly, that can be frustrating in real life, but it can kind of make sociology more fun to do. That there's this disconnect between what we say and what we do. And when we start to examine that, it becomes, I think, really interesting. There's also this assumption that because religion tells us something, or we can interpret religion to tell us this or to tell us that, that we're going to behave in ways that are congruent with that, right? That we're going to fit into or fit with this. And religion doesn't occupy a social vacuum, something I began to think about after years and years of picking at this project. That religion matters, it definitely influences behavior, but it's never going to be the only thing that influences behavior. It's one of many sort of conflicting value theories to draw on favor, or one of many lenses through which we kind of see the world and make sense of the world around us. What I found first, and to me, looking back, this seems like a little bit of a no-brainer to me. Religion is something we're raised into for the most part, right? But all the research on religion and environment that I could find talked about adult religious people and their adult religious or adult environmental views. You'd think that if religion affected environmental views, that would start in childhood, not adulthood, right? So the first thing I started to think about was, how does religious upbringing shape us in terms of environmental issues? And so I compared people who are raised religious and stay that way to people who are raised religious and leave to people who are never religious at all. You might call them the stayers, the X's, and the nevers, if you like. The X's are actually the most environmentally concerned of all. People who are consistently, and I see this across religious traditions, people who are raised in religion but leave sometime after the age of 16 are actually the most environmentally concerned. They're more environmentally concerned than people who are never religious, and they're more environmentally concerned than people who were raised religious and stay that way. That made me scratch my head. Why would that be? Why would that happen? And I started to look at who's actually unaffiliated, right? Who isn't religious? What do unaffiliated people look like? Well, most unaffiliated people are raised religious in the United States, 2/3 or so. Many people who call themselves unaffiliated still believe in various religious doctrines, life after death, some kind of personal God or higher power. They have practices. They still pray. They still do some of these kinds of things. And what I found, interestingly enough, among religiously unaffiliated people, people who pray are more environmentally concerned than people who don't. That cued into me this set of phenomena in cultural sociology through Bourdieu, the habitus, that we learn this collection of practices from the time that we're a kid, and we can't even see them happening. They have kind of an invisible and pervasive influence on who we are and who we grow up to be. And I started to go, well, it looks like religion and religious upbringing indirectly positively influences environmental concern based on this, which again is not what I would have expected to find. So I started to think about this in terms of social networks, for example. People who are raised religious, what do religious kids get to do that people who are religiously unaffiliated don't get to do? Well, they go to camp, they interact outside. There's all these outdoor spaces where they get to communicate with and interact with one another from an early age. Add on top of that the fact that most unaffiliated people fit the sort of profile for an environmentalist, right? They're middle class, they're relatively highly educated, they're left of center politically, and you can see why this picture would start to sort of unfold. So religion has this constructive, if indirect, influence on environmental concern if we look at it from the upbringing standpoint. I've gotten up through chapter 3 basically. I don't want to belabor that point, but I think that's one of the more interesting insights that came out of this. In chapter 4, I for a long time I kind of went, when I was doing all this data analysis, all these complex statistical models I was building, what the hell happened in 1992 in the United States, right? Environmental concern before 1992 is not nearly as divisive. It drops off really dramatically in 1992, and it's not everybody. It's largely partisan. This is where the Republican Party, this is where the US conservative right organizes around anti-environmentalism in 1992. Before that, you could see effects of age that are more significant. You could see effects of religion and theology that are more significant. After 1992, it sharpens around partisan divides. And in many ways, what you see is partisan politics carries forward religion, almost starts to look like a religion unto itself in some ways, right? Particularly the political right becomes hardened, becomes, this sort of master identity. I identify as a Republican, therefore I'm not environmentally concerned. I don't think climate change is real. When I think back, and I've talked to my advisor, I've talked to Bob Antonio about this, and what happened in 1992? Well, the Rio Summit. The world's leaders came back from the Rio Summit with this new information about what would have to be done to get ahead of climate change, how comprehensive the big picture changes would have to be. And this is when the propaganda machine goes into overtime. Am I still talking about religion? To some extent, I still am, but this is where environmentalism kind of becomes a casualty of the culture wars, because there are still religious people, even conservative religious people after 1992, who are really interested in environmental issues. But when they pop up, they get this really big pushback. Don't talk about that. I think of Richard Land and the Southern Baptists, who stood up in the 90s and said, we need to care about the earth. And what did the Southern Baptists do? Get out of here, right? We need a new leader now. At the same time, religion and ecology becomes the sort of mainstream area of inquiry. There's a lot of big schools doing this. I presented some of this early work at Yale. I'm still a little surprised Yale let me in, but yeah, I got to present some of this work years ago there. And it's kind of compelling that we're starting to sort of narrativize, to sort of telling this story in a way after politics has become more and more salient, big picture wise, but little picture wise, you still see a lot of these things sort of cropping up across religious groups, culminating in Laudato Si. If you were following the presidential primaries on the Republican side in 2016, what did Marco Rubio say when asked about his Catholic heritage and climate change? He said, well, the Pope says climate change is real. I think climate change is real and it's a problem. What happened to Marco Rubio? Fell out of the race, right? Yeah. We look at Bush. He's a Catholic convert. What does he say? He fared even worse. Well, Laudato Si says you're supposed to care about climate change. The Pope says, and what did he say? Well, I don't think religion and politics should be intermingled. You don't say that to the Republicans during the primary. Bye-bye, right? So there's these interesting phenomena that emerge along these axes, even as politics becomes more and more salient. I'm saying this too, I predict somebody's going to ask me about politics and how that affects environmental concern. That's a huge part of the story, certainly, and I would be remiss to deny that, right? Then I broke it down. I'm a sociologist. I'm fascinated by race, class, gender, and equality. So I had to look at who's changing, who's the most dynamic. Even religious environmental concern, which is framed in many ways by people who advocate for it as a big tent in environmental issues, that environmentalists tend to be, bourgeois white liberals, right, who live in the city and have college degrees and tell everybody to build more bicycle paths, right? Religious ecology is supposed to be, well, we need to think about environmentalism.
Kurt's been called out officially by Lucas.
Got me. Sorry. Continue, please.
No, not at all. What we find, big picture wise, even though a lot of the groups, religious environmental groups, they're trying to pitch environmentalism to urban populations that are shut out, low income populations, rural populations. It's still middle class, white, bourgeois. Environmentalism, religious or secular, seems to have that dimension, right? You see more and more of that. So if there's a message here, right? If you are a religious person who is interested in ecological engagement, there's still work to do on that front. I've looked at some qualitative work. I think that people have been more inclusive in religious ecology in terms of bringing in low-income people, bringing in rural populations into environmental engagement and activism. But statistically speaking, it's still very much a middle-class phenomenon, right? We look at gender. Interestingly enough, men lead the charge in terms of dynamics when it comes to religious environmentalism on paper. But I would hypothesize that's because religion has actually feminized over the last 50 or 60 years in the United States. What I mean is more and more women are being allowed into leadership positions in the church. And interestingly enough, we see this thesis across the board. The more women get access to the halls of power, the more environmentally concerned institutions tend to become. There's still debate about why that is, but it's a fascinating thing, and I think that's what we're seeing to some extent in religion. I think that's why we don't see that as much in some of the more conservative and more fundamentalist branches of religion that have largely kept women out of the upper leadership. So big picture-wise, I go into sociology of risk, the fact that the stakes are really high, that democracy is in danger, and all this fun stuff at the very end, that religion is a symbol of civil society in many ways, and that the erosion of civil society is going to bode badly for democracy when we start to face hazards. I wrote those sentences before COVID happened, but I had to sort of underline them a couple of times when COVID started to unfold and we started to see precisely that happen, right? I don't think religion is the only place this could happen, but I'm thinking of religion as the most visible and most powerful historical aspect of U.S. civil society. And that's why I kept drawing upon it as a place to sort of address risk, mitigate risk, start to come to terms with environmental change from a different angle, at a different level than what we typically might see. So I think that's what I got in a nutshell. As far as the book, I'm happy to chat, answer questions, talk a little bit more. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was great. I'd like to kind of look at the data for a moment. If you could talk about like what maybe like the regional breakdowns of this are, if maybe like more rural, southern religious communities have this same kind of breakdown, if it's kind of across the board, what does that look like, if there's any kind of data on it?
Great question. Fascinated by it as a transplant from the north to the south and back again.
Wait, are you comfortable saying where in the South?
Yeah, I grew up in the Dallas, Texas area.
Okay.
And
I'm in South Louisiana, so that's why I ask.
Oh, okay. I've been down there several times. I used to go fishing off the coast down there.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, great place. So basically, there are regional differences. Predictably, they are fairly significant, but they're often not what you'd expect either. I measured environmental concern on two dimensions. One being sort of environmental stewardship. How much responsibility do humans have to improve and protect the environment? The other being conservation. How much responsibility do we have to protect national parks, to protect recreation, to protect spaces, not only from human influence, but also for human use, for human recreation? And what you find in the South is that stewardship is lower in the South, but conservation is not. And I think that's because that ethic taps into this sort of outdoor culture. And you find this in the South in a great sense, but you also find this in the rural North. I live about 100 miles from the Canadian border right now. There's a lot of hunting up here. There's a lot of fishing up here. And there's also, even among people who lean to the right politically, there almost is this sense of sanctity about the environment because people are participating in this year after year as a ritual and as part of their lives. So there is a regional divide, but I would speculate that regional divide probably collapses more into an urban-rural divide. If that answers your question.
No, it actually does. It kind of scans with my experiences too. We grew up, we're in the petrochemical corridor, so we have like a higher cancer rate in this area, like Cancer Alley. But also the conservationist elements that's kind of within our cultural signifiers is very, very strong. There's very seldom I'll see a pickup truck that doesn't have the fleur de lis that's a fish and a deer and a duck on it. So it's interesting to hear kind of the religious aspect folded into the environmental protection mindset. I just how do we bridge that? How do we communicate that sentiment?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Going all the way back to the Puritans, we have this sort of ethic. We think about wilderness as being this sublime place, right? This place that's disconnected from some of the messiness of human intervention and interaction. A place that we can escape.
The Theodore Roosevelt type view of conservation.
Yeah, and this is an old idea. It has a lot of sort of imaginaries that pop up again and again. And I think there have been efforts up here in Minnesota. Minnesota is a blue state, but Minnesota is a light blue state. There's a lot of red. I live in a pretty red county up here in Minnesota. If you can tap into that ethic, that consciousness, that if you pollute the water, I can't go fishing anymore, I can't get out on my boat anymore, I can't go hunt deer, I can't teach my kids to do these things that I've been doing perhaps for generations. You can get some movement that way, but it's really a question of salience because we live in a two-party system. Will that overpower some of these other sort of culture wars issues, for example?
Right. That's interesting because I've always said as far as my area goes, my region of the country goes, probably the greatest success of the oil and gas industry is like convincing the working class people of this area that their only means of economic mobility, of any kind of climbing the ladder, is to be complicit in their own kind of environmental destruction. And that's that sentiment I think people kind of get, but it's that hurdle of stepping over, like, okay, well, clearly the thing that has, and this is with the Rust Belt too, the thing that has given us economic mobility either no longer exists or is still hurting us directly.
Yeah, there's this sort of populism that comes out of this, and you definitely see this in the Rust Belt, right? I have a friend who lives in the Detroit area, and people will elect anybody who says they'll bring the car jobs back. The car jobs ain't coming back, guys. It's not going to happen. We see this in where I live. The Iron Range isn't far from us. There are folks up that way. They'll bring the mining jobs back. Well, do you want the mining jobs back? Because living downstream from the mining jobs is not the most pleasant thing in the world. Right? We still have orange water in some parts of Bemidji up here because of the history of mining. Yeah, our water's orange sometimes.
Oh my god!
Gross.
It's filter it.
I mean, is that what they really tell you? Is just filter it by a Brita?
Well, it's just rust.
Just a little extra spice.
A little lead.
A little oxidized iron.
With some turmeric.
A little lead.
Flavor.
Yeah, I wonder what the anemia rates are in that area based on the iron in the water.
Ooh.
That's a good question.
Yeah. And I exaggerate a little bit too. A lot of the lakes here you can see all the way to the bottom. They're really clear, they're really beautiful, and people have a lot of respect for that. But it is interesting how that populist sort of economic mobilization can insert itself into these environments in this way. Well, if you're not willing to put up with the utter plunder of the environment, then you're an enemy of progress and you're not going to get a job.
Yeah, it's that dangerous propaganda where like these things are like tied within the cultural identity of these regions. If you're a Rust Belt man, you're a factory worker. If you're a Gulf Coast man, you're working in petrochem or you're in like agriculture, and they want to take away your burgles. They want to take away your pickup truck. But, I watched a Vice piece on coal miners in Australia, and they just went down to do like a man on the ground type situation. And the question they asked everybody was, if there was a green energy initiative in this area, would you be okay with phasing out coal? And almost unanimously, the answer was always yes. But because of propaganda, they don't think that's what's being offered. It is, but the propaganda and the culture war stuff is so prevalent, it's so pervasive within media that they look at the people who are offering that as silly socialists, silly Green Party environmentalist hippy dippy people.
Yeah, I grew up blue collar. I worked in fluid power, which is really proximate to oil back in Texas for a long time before I was an academic. This is kind of my fourth career, and yeah, you really see that. Blue collar work when you're doing it is not nearly as romantic as you sometimes hear some of this propaganda making it sound. Right? It's dirty and it's dangerous and it's hot,
Yeah.
and it can be fulfilling, and it'll put groceries on your table, but at the end of the day, it can be no fun, right?
Yeah.
I
I'd
think
like to
Greg is-
see it. I'm sorry. You can go ahead, Professor.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think Greg is chomping at the bit. to
Oh, I
ask
didn't want to
about-
dominate. I
wasn't
I have like 10 questions already. I'm like ready.
I
So-
was
Why don't
reading
you go
the
ahead?
thing.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so I read. So okay, I'm a scientist, and I'm interested in saving the environment from human harm, basically. And so this is a really interesting topic for me because so many people are religious, obviously, don't share my own sentiments. So I've always wondered how we can use framing of religious issues to try to help tell stories in our science, help communicate with people. And your research is just something that I've never seen before, and it was really counterintuitive, and I love that. So I really appreciate that. So thank you. So I was reading the article that you wrote on like the view of life, the 2020 article, and you were talking. You have this really interesting graph that I don't know if you can like pull it up, Marcus, or anything, but I could put it in the chat. But can you talk about what really stood out for me was the Jewish population and especially the older Jewish population that was born 1884 to 1905. That Jewish population is higher in concerns around the environment than some other modern day religious fundamentalists. So, I mean, what would cause that? Do you have any idea or hypotheses?
I can hypothesize a little bit. I'm certainly not an expert in Judaism, but I could talk a little bit about what I think is happening because Jewish populations were really interesting in this study because they're one of the few groups that went fairly decisively downward across generations. One of the things I think is happening there is secularization, that a lot of younger Jewish people who are more culturally progressive are disaffiliating from their Judaic heritage, right? They're not necessarily, maybe they're more like me in a sense. They're, I'm culturally Catholic. I don't really practice anymore, but I grew up Catholic, right?
Yeah.
They're culturally Jewish. Maybe they identify as unaffiliated. They've moved away from the religion in which they were raised. And so the people who are still actively hanging on to their Jewish heritage might tend to be a little bit more culturally orthodox, right? And they might be steered more in that direction. Though as a population, Jewish folks in the United States tend to be pretty left of center politically. So there's a lot of interesting sort of dynamics going there that cross-cut. So I think I can hypothesize simply based on what I know, but I think I'd have to run some new models to really figure out what's going on that way.
Interesting. I'm interested in Judaism, and you have a really interesting piece on Catholicism as well in 2020 in the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. And fortunately, I couldn't read it, but I read your abstract, which was interesting. And I mean, Catholicism is interesting in my view because it's a progressive religion in that it changes over time, right? You have people on earth that are actually able to, with the authority of God, make changes. And something like Christianity, where you have a biblical text and then it's all based off of that. So can you I'd like to kind of like talk about that, but then how does like Catholicism, does that like Catholicism and Christianity dynamic, I'm wondering if that follows through with like Islam. So you have the same dynamic with Shia Muslims that are progressive, that have people on earth that can talk to God and make decrees, and then you have Sunni Islam, where they're a lot like Christians, where they have the biblical text and they go off of that.
I can talk a little bit about that. So the paper itself was on how popes have seen the environment differently in the Catholic Church. If you go back to say John the 23rd, I believe, in the mid 20th century. He's telling a story of earthly dominion. Humans, you get to do what you want to the environment. Don't listen to these crazy environmentalists when they tell you should only have 2 kids and all this kind of stuff. You see this pretty radical change from that point in the 60s into, say, the 90s with John Paul II, who's telling a very different story. No, the earth matters. It's a justice. He actually frames it this way. It's a social justice issue to care about the environment and to care about how the destruction of the environment not only is intrinsically bad but also impacts human beings. So Catholics always stay sort of judiciously on the human-centered side of this debate. Like they're not going to throw in completely ecocentric, but they have framed, I think, pretty successfully. They've bridged this frame, this social justice frame, and this environmentalism frame, and you really see that with Pope Francis. But this has been building for decades when you get to this point. A lot of the churches, interestingly enough, in the United States, a lot of the Protestant denominations, if you look at, say, Lutheranism or Presbyterianism, they have a fairly history of at least thinking about these issues, and they've really codified a lot of environmental concern in their sort of in their work, these more mainline Protestant denominations, beginning in the 1970s. In some ways, they're responding to these cultural currents. In some ways, we could say, relative to 100 years ago, we're all environmentalists, right? Even though, what does that mean in terms of global climate change and some of the terrible things that might be coming down the pipeline for us? Religions have responded dynamically. Many Protestant groups have responded dynamically. Some Protestant groups have pulled back too and have said that's idolatry, right? That's earth worship, pantheism. We don't want any part of that. But you find even folks like Richard Land in the Southern Baptist Conference who stepped forward and said, "No, this is important. We need to be better stewards." He got a lot of pushback and eventually got ousted, right? But you do see that across a lot of Protestant denominations in the United States. Though it's much more difficult to make a stand if your denomination is much more culturally orthodox.
Do you look at Islam like this is all Catholicism, and are those people kind of wrapped up in the fundamentalist other than Protestants, or is this all Christianity and Catholicism?
Most of my book is about Christianity, but that's because the United States has historically had such a large Christian population.
Gotcha.
Not because I'm uninterested. Islam, I've looked over the fence a little bit. Muslims in the United States are pretty significantly environmentally concerned. There are a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons why that's emerged when it did. But also Islam more broadly as a global religion has become more environmentally concerned since the 1990s. There are a lot of Muslim voices raising this concern. And I think we have the stereotype in the US about Islam being connected to the Middle East, being connected to petrochemical plunder, right?
Exactly.
That really challenges me too when I think about that. And I'd like to do more work on that in the future.
Yeah, I was looking at Pope Benedict in the 2008, like signing the decree with the Islam leaders and stuff, talking about the environmental importance and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting. Go ahead. Sorry, Grandma.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, do you ever look at any data around Mormon communities in this? Because
that's a great question.
That's a section of the faith-based population that I don't know, man. they get a little wild.
I can say Mormons are a fascinating subpopulation or sect of Christianity in the United States, right? For one thing, it'd be really important to know what Mormons think on a lot of stuff, because they're perhaps the fastest growing religious group in terms of the United States. They're one of the few religious groups that's seen positive upward growth in terms of their numbers year after year after year. Whereas a lot of
1830 was the founding.
Yeah, it's a pretty new religion. I've met a lot of Mormons. I've talked to a lot of Mormons, and I would say most Mormons identify as Christian as well, right? They see themselves as a branch of Christianity. They see themselves as a later branch of Christianity, right? Some would debate, or religious scholars would debate about whether this is actually a new religious movement that comes out of this Christian context. But it's certainly growing in a way that most religious groups aren't. Mormons are interesting because they have some very left of center ideas about things like distributing wealth. Right? If you learn a lot about the Mormon Church, they have charity, they have widespread charity for low income Mormons. They really do help each other, they really do invest heavily in that. There are Mormons who are interested in environmental issues. I don't know a lot about them and how much influence they have within the mainstream of their own religious group, but they're also pretty right of center in some other ways, right? That they have been really opposed to abortion, really opposed to gay rights, really opposed to some of these other issues. There are, and I think Catholicism parallels that in some ways. Catholicism has some real left of center ideas and some real right of center ideas in terms of what ends up becoming Catholic doctrine. There's something distinctive about that.
And I mean, historically, at least with the Abrahamic faiths, we can look to things like liberation theology, like Burkina Faso, Sankara, like motivations and the usage of scripture.
Yeah. And the current Pope, Francis, he was a liberation theologian. He comes from South America. He's Argentinian, I believe. And he was involved in liberation theology earlier on.
Yeah.
So did you distinguish between like fundamentalists and those people who are, what I want to say, there's a term for it, like lukewarm Catholics or whatever, like people who aren't as like, the Bible is the literal interpretation of the God, and if you don't follow it to the T, you're going to burn hell forever.
They call those cafeteria Catholics.
Yes, that's the term. That's the term.
Interesting.
I don't know, Greg, did you have another term?
Well, it's transmaterialism, I want to say, that where it actually, you're like the wafer that you're taking is the literal body of Christ kind of thing.
Transubstantiation.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thinking about how to process this the best, I did look at theological differences in some of my models. Theological differences themselves start to collapse around 1992. Denomination stays significant to some extent, but this is where you see some of that sort of partisanship creeping in. And what becomes difficult about thinking about theology or thinking about denomination is that since the 1960s, a lot of American Christianity has organized or reorganized itself in some fairly profound ways that start to look political, right? That start to look partisan. You have so-called evangelical Protestants who are much more literalist in their interpretation of the Bible, who in many cases might think the earth is 6,000 years old, who are willing to lean into some of those ideas. And then you have more mainline Protestants who are going to change with the times a little bit more and are going to be more receptive to some of these ideas. And these things parallel but aren't the same as environmental issues. I've read some work on creationists and fundamentalists who are also environmentally concerned. There's some good historical work on that comes out, but that they get derailed by these sort of political priorities in the late 20th century as well. They've built some momentum. They've got a movement. They're very conservative in some ways culturally, but they're still interested in environmental issues. But they kind of get sidetracked or sidelined, these environmental issues, because so many other issues become more salient. The culture wars issues that emerge over and over again. When we talk about things like abortion and contraception and same-sex marriage, that these things emerge over and over again and seem to sort of drown out some of these discussions about environmentalism.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is, if the right isn't stirring up the base, basically, like religious people tend to be more concerned about the environment.
Well, yeah, environmentalism has in very many ways become a casualty of the culture wars. I think that's
fascinating.
Yeah, so I kind of want to like touch on that a little bit because I don't know if you're able to really necessarily quantify this. But what comes into my brain when I think about that, how environmentalism has become a culture war casualty for people who are in modern American Christianity and all of its denominations. I kind of wonder what came first, like the chicken or the egg. Was this simply people who are in any sort of like organized Christian religious institution simply have a susceptibility to political propaganda, or whether this was the institution itself was fundamentally environmentalist, and people were sort of brought up in that notion of environmentalism, which was then sort of abstracted or corrupted by political information coming outwards. Like, I don't know, it seems really like the lines have blurred together so much I can't really in my brain separate like what official religious institutions believe regarding the environment versus the political propaganda, which I know because I am on the receiving end of so much of it constantly, just by existing in America. So maybe you could shed a little bit of light on that for me.
Great question.
Happy to. So I think, and I'm thinking back to James Hunter's book, Culture Wars, and James Hunter, people are interviewing him again after the Trump presidency. What do these culture wars look like? And I think he explained it fairly well. And I've seen some other works like Robert P. Jones's The End of White Christian America. There's this existential fear that has been harnessed and honed and tempered in many circles on the political right in the United States, that your world, your lifestyle, your culture, your very existence is being taken away from you. It's being redefined as immoral. It's being redefined as unacceptable. You're being pushed out of the public sphere. You're being pushed out of the cultural center. Your kids are being indoctrinated into beliefs that are at odds with the things you want to teach them and think they should carry forward. And there is this real fear, right? So that propaganda is masterful in that it can capture that fear, but I think that fear is a real fear that many people share. When we look at the landscape, and I've talked to people who are deeply religious over the years, and if I show them two pie charts, right, they'll go, yeah, that. One pie chart from 1971 where the unaffiliated are this tiny little sliver, and one pie chart from 2018 where the unaffiliated are this huge chunk of the population and are disproportionately the children, the young people who are growing up. They go, yeah, that terrifies me. I can't, it's difficult to wrap their head around it. And why can't we have a radical return to religion? Why can't we have a radical return to the good old days? And of course, the good old days are never good, right? Reactionary politics is always sort of based on a mirage, because the good old days, there never were good old days, right? There never was a golden age for anybody. Least of all for a lot of folks in the United States right now who face persecution, who fight constantly to hang on to their rights, right? That there's this fear that they'll be taken away any day by a Supreme Court decision or by some new legislation. It's harnessed because it's there, because it's real. And the propaganda is masterful. I got to admire how slick it is, even though it's really disturbing to say the least.
Yeah, so that actually does make good sense. I think that kind of points it more towards the propaganda being sort of the corrupting agent, and people within religion not necessarily being bent one way or the other towards environmentalism, but that propaganda so masterfully captures them and really appeals to that fear, that base instinct of the world around you is turning into everything you've been raised to hate, and you should oppose that at all costs. And one of those costs, unfortunately, seems to be the environment. So I guess maybe to offer a contrast to that, because you do talk about folks within religion who are very much environmentally concerned and inclined and want to actually see material change with respect to the environment. My question is, how do you sort of almost foment that mindset within religious people? And I'm sure that's no easy task, of course, but it seems like, does it have to come from within the institution? Does it have to be Christians having a dialogue with Christians? Is it something that we in any sort of non-affiliated space can talk to our religious community members, friends, family about, to sort of help encourage thinking about the environment? Because where my mind naturally leads me to in a circumstance like this is how do we take what the people who are religious and concerned about the environment think, and sort of replicate that in some of their other, religious community members who might not necessarily be environmentally inclined.
I think there is a challenge, and I know when I talked to the Evolution Institute about this a few months back, I brought this up too. Religion has this potential to enact change, and in a really powerful sort of way, right? Religion is a really powerful social force, to put it in classical sociological terms. At the same time, religion has a tendency to erect barriers, right? It serves this pretty significant gatekeeping function, where if you wanted to engage in cultivating environmental concern among religious groups, there are a lot of organizations out there that do that. But if I'm a member of a religious sect that believes that our way is the right way and the only way, I might not want to participate in an interfaith dialogue, because I'm going to feel like that's at best a distraction from what I'm actually believing in, what I'm actually doing. So I guess the short answer, this isn't a very short answer, but I guess the short answer to your question, the more mainline and the more liberal denominations of any religious group are going to be more likely to come to the table with secular people and talk to them about environmental issues. The more orthodox folks, I think reaching more orthodox folks is going to involve people from within that religious group. Reaching those folks, I don't think I could go. I don't think I could go talk to them and say, "Hey, you should be environmentally concerned." They're going to go, "Who are you? Go away!" Right?
Get off my door, commie.
Yeah, I mean, that really it speaks to the challenge, right? Because we could dissect the issue 364 ways from January 1st, but at the end of the day, if it's not coming from the folks around them, sort of within their sphere, it seems like we're really like up against kind of this echo chamber that really seems to be hard to disrupt. Because I come from a background, at least as it pertains to like medicine, public health, and sort of biological science, where we kind of approach things with the information deficit model, which really seems to be outdated and ineffective in a lot of circumstances. And I think that's almost kind of an approach that a lot of people would instinctively take with respect to this. They would just want to slap all these religious people in the church pews with a book about how the climate is changing and everyone's going to burn, and not in like the hellish way, but in like the temperature going up too much kind of way. So at that point, like it just really, I think, magnifies how difficult the task is going to be to really rally everybody, including religious people, behind addressing climate change.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of research on science education. I'd say that's more than a hobby for me too. I'm really interested in scientific literacy. The knowledge deficit model, it presupposes a model of the human mind that's not how we work, right? We're not thinking critters that feel. We're affective critters that process and rationalize what we do after the fact, right? Affect, behavior, cognition, the ABCs of social psychology. What we have to do if we want to improve scientific literacy is tell better stories, basically. And not be afraid to engage emotion, not be afraid to engage some of those normative dimensions, right? I think we'll be more successful. I also think there's potential for that to become divisive too in some of the same ways, but I think there's going to be more net success that way. Better stories.
I totally agree. I mean, very interestingly enough, I think that in your papers, I was reading it, not called climate change, it's environmentally concerned. I mean, is that just because of like you having to look through literature and look through people's opinions on things, or is it like, I guess, how are you collecting this data? Is it just try to catching more people, or why that wordage?
So that's language from environmental sociology. There's a huge literature on environmental concern, and it goes back to the late 1970s. The data I'm using was actually, I didn't collect the data. There's tens of thousands of cases over 40 years that were collected at the University of Chicago through the General Social Survey, and I did the model building and the analysis stuff. I joke that I'm a really asocial sociologist because I do theory and I do quantitative data analysis. So I mostly sit in front of my computer and do social science.
Yeah.
But I do think there's advantages to changing the dialogue, right? It feels like, yeah, climate change is real and climate change is a problem, but it feels like because climate change has become such a casualty of culture wars and partisan politics, can we change the language? I'm
great
attempting
question.
this when I use environmental change, right?
Exactly. And that's such a good point. And I try to point that out when I make videos and stuff like that. And I hate the word climate change, actually, just because it's such a small part of how we're impacting the environment negatively. The biggest problem, in my opinion, is the mass extinction that's going on. And it's a lot easier for people to grasp like mass extinction, like dead animal bad, like lots of dead animals very bad. And I wonder, I guess, I mean, this is kind of like a survey question or a research question. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm thinking about parallels in allegories and in stories and religion that we can use and draw upon, where mass death or genocides or something like that, where we can look and use those stories as like, hey, this is, mass extinction's bad. And I wonder about basically like what religions would be more in favor of environmental concern. And I wonder about like what stories are similar amongst them that we could like draw upon.
Sure. So I can't help but think, and I probably learned more about being Catholic doing this project than I did from going to Sunday school for 12 years when I was a kid, right? But I did discover Saint Francis of Assisi, for example, who to me is this great avatar of what greener Christianity could look like. And I'm certainly not the first person to point that out. I could go back to Lynn White Jr.'s piece, which was published in Nature in 1967, and he talks about the roots of our ecological crisis. He lays the entire ecological crisis at the feet of Western civilization, particularly Western Christianity. But he doesn't do so to blame Christianity, and that's how he's often interpreted. It says people only read the first half of his paper, right? The second half of his paper, he says, but I'm a Christian and I'm a scientist and I like, some of the things that we've accomplished. And so, how might we sort of change the conversation? St. Francis of Assisi, he offers the doctrine of the animal soul, for example, which might sound a little quaint, right, to modern ears. This idea that's still heretical in Catholicism, right, that maybe we should see animals as having something like personhood, and maybe we should treat them with a greater degree of respect and not see them as things, right, that we can just use. If I go too far in that direction, what I'm going to find very quickly is that the modern Abrahamic religions are going to get off the bus, right? They're going to say, no, we're human-centered religions. We're not into this, pantheistic sort of model of the world, right? To me, this is a way to shift the conversation in two different sort of ways. One, to sort of think smaller about some of these issues, even though they're massive issues, right? Mass extinction of species is a massive issue. If I live in an area, and I do, where people love to deer hunt, and they discovered that, there are plagues that are thinning out the deer population, like chronic wasting disease, you can get those people motivated to enact certain measures to prevent that, right? You might have a hard time motivating them to, donate money to save the polar bears, right? Even though, I live in Minnesota, the polar bears really aren't that far north from me. But you're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna have a hard time getting people to donate money. The sort of far away dimension of environmentalism, it becomes abstract. If you can bring it home, if you can show it to somebody, if you can put it in their face and say, "Look, this is happening to you, and it's happening to you right now," you might have a lot more luck getting some traction and being able to tell a better story. And the second half of this, I get back to critical theory land, right? Where maybe something wrong with Western civilization as a whole, in the sense that we have embraced to such an extent instrumental reason, right? That we have come to treat everything as a means. We call it the cult of bigness, the cult of efficiency, the cult of growth. I'm going to start sounding cranky if I keep going in this direction, but I think these are the big sort of cultural ideas that Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer and some of the original sort of critical theorists were really interested in, this critique of instrumental reason, because instrumental reason presupposes sort of the greatest good for the most, right? That on average, economies grow. If we just let capitalism do its thing, on average, economies grow. Yeah, but a bunch of people get ground under as we do this, right? That's bad, right? that starts
I'd
to
say
look
so.
like, I mean, that starts to look like stuff, sort of proto-fascism, right? Which is essentially what they're arguing, that, you know, when you start to create a society that's built on efficiency, you start to sacrifice real human beings to achieve these long-term ends. And this is a bigger problem, I think, when we look at environmental issues. And I don't want to get too far afield, but this is something that animates a lot of my work.
Yeah, bringing it local is something that I'm trying to, just like you're saying, reshift the thinking of people, like away from the CO2 ppm global thing, which is something that you're never going to, even if the best environmental stewards and you're doing all this stuff, you're never going to be able to see how your impact individually changed CO2 ppm. So it's fruitless, right? It's this huge titan that's coming at you, and there's nothing that you can do to stop it. Rather than, you know, something in ecology that we know really well is that we need environmental health. That's how we have better human health, and we do that very simply, is that we have more animals, more different species, and in each of those species we have lots of animals. So and this kind of brings it home to your local government and how people can engage these issues with like zoning. So zoning issues have a huge impact, and right now where, you know, nature's kind of archipelagoed out, where it's just like these little patches of nature, versus connecting those together, then we can kind of like start seeing these environmental changes. We can see the introduction of more species. We can see a larger amount of animals thriving in that area. And I really think that religious environmental stewards, how can we bring that back? You know, bring that back of like, this is your little area and you can see it and you can track these numbers and you can track these species and you can see how well you're doing right then and there. And I wonder about talking to people, religious people, being like, this is your little area that God gave you. Do well with it.
Yeah, I think every culture that has ever been has to do this, right? They have to have a way to make sense of their relationship to the place they live, and making sense of that relationship has to be done in a way that they're not going to wipe themselves out in a relatively short time period, right? And this sort of attachment to place, and I feel when I say this out loud, I feel like this is something I'm still learning about, as not only as a essentially white settler in the United States, right? That my family comes from Europe, that I live on and teach on and work on indigenous lands right now, as we all do in the United States. What does that mean? What is the significance of land? What is the significance of place? What might be potentially sacred about that community, that small space, that environment that could be recaptured, that could be rethought? I admit my own ignorance, but also admit that I'm fascinated by those possibilities.
You know, Lucas, I'm kind of surprised you kind of held back on the critical theory stuff there. So I'm just going to give a plug for, I don't even know if, yeah, he's alive, William Lease, right? So wrote this great Marxist critique of this called The Domination of Nature, where he says basically, inequality starts with man's attempt to dominate nature, right? And anyway, I just wanted to throw that. I like to give the kids something to read.
Well, my bookshelf is growing, and I do not have the time matching in growth. So one day, maybe.
Look at all these, look at my piles, man. And that's just one room in my house.
Yeah, I guess we're all building our libraries, one Ministry of Science episode at a time. Here, let me loop in Dr. Buenabuen, because I wanted to make sure if you had any questions or salient thoughts that you had a chance. So go ahead.
Well, I mean, I've been thinking about a few threads that have been going around. One is the stories we tell. The other is what's the focus of these different religious groups, and I want to pose kind of a dichotomy. Are the religious groups, is their environmental message something that's anthropocentric, which means that what they're doing is they're casting this in terms of what is good for man and mankind, and everything from the utilitarian calculus of it to, is it the right thing to do, is the moral motive correct? Those are both very anthropocentric ethical frameworks, utilitarianism and deontology. Mm-hmm. Or is it something that is shifted, or are there some that have shifted the discussion to a biocentric focus, in which humanity is not the center? It's not centered. It's the actual environment and the animals and the biology of the ecosystem that is more of a concern than the human inhabitants. I would guess that they're still kind of locked onto their anthropocentric island, but I think that if they really want to get to their goal of environmental stewardship, they need to shift into a biocentric frame of thinking. And so what would you say about that? Do you have any comments about that kind of conjecture?
Win-win. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's such a fascinating aspect of this. The short answer, I think, is are most of these efforts still anthropocentric? Yes, most of them are. Some of them are quite deliberately anthropocentric. That you get these slogans out of religious environmentalism, like "people, not polar bears." Right? We're going to focus on the issues, the food issues that people in the inner city face, rather than on sending $25 to Greenpeace a month so they can save the polar bears. Right? This is a deliberate shift in the discourse in some ways. And I think that there are limitations here, right? If we're talking about Abrahamic religions as being framed in these rather anthropocentric terms, rather explicitly anthropocentric terms, you might only be able to go so far toward biocentrism without sort of losing the thread. And I think you get something that is kind of deontological out of this, right? Some of the more successful frame bridging efforts, like the Catholic Church, that concern for the earth and concern for the poor, concern for the least of us, is part of Christian doctrine. And these things need to be connected together, right? And that's a pretty effective set of messaging. It's worked, but it doesn't resituate humans relative to the rest of the cosmos. There are people trying to do that, but they often end up getting kind of pushed out of the mainstream of their religious group when they start to talk about it. Get in trouble.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that it's threatening in a lot of ways. I mean, if not the least, to the power structure that exists on that anthropocentric worldview.
Yeah,
it's so interesting to me. It's just like I guess I just can't get out of my mind that God, in a religious worldview, God gave us the earth. Why would you want to trash the thing that you live on in order to say that you're doing such a good job as a human? I can't. That's such a good framing, Dr. Winkelman. That was really interesting.
Well, I mean, if you think about science itself and religion, epistemologically, science is a little bit more minimalistic in that it only rejects revelation as a source of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Observation, experimentation, authority. I forget the fourth one, but there's another, logic, perhaps, deduction. I'm not sure. Anyway, religion and science both accept these forms of epistemology, except science rejects revelation as a source of knowledge, and religion accepts it. So they can kind of squeeze in things just by revelation, right? Somebody has a dream. And they develop a doctrine about it, and voila, we have new knowledge, God-given knowledge, no less. And they can manipulate things that way. It's very easy to do on a institutional level if you have the power. But that's a very cynical kind of take.
So what you're saying is we find out the religious people and give them drugs and hope they have environmentally themed dreams. Is that what we're doing?
Something like that. Hey, it's worth experimenting with. It's worth an experiment or two.
It is really
biology is working on the psilocybin and the hallucinogenic aspect of it, which is very much correlated with environmental thought after consuming said substance. So, hey, maybe we got an experiment on our hands here.
Dude, him seeing burning bushes. I mean, the dude was tripping on mushrooms hard. Let's be real. Like, come on. Come on.
I move that next Ministry of Science, we all get some mushrooms and put this into test.
There we go.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
What can go wrong?
I'm way ahead of you.
We dissolve our egos, we dissolve our ids, we loosen our identities, and reabsorb ourselves into the environment.
Yeah, might need to find Twitch staff, see if that's against terms of service.
Naturally. It's a science experiment.
Well, I mean, is getting drunk on stream against TOS?
That's a good question.
I think if it's legal in your country, then it's fine.
Well, like excessive. Like when it's clear that you're like becoming a problem, like that's whenever you skirt the lines. It's a gray area, but you can totally like do, so long as it's legal where you're at, you can do like, whatever recreational barbiturates you prefer.
How, I guess like my question would be like, where's your research going now? Like, yeah, so you used this data set that's in mind that with bioinformatics, my bio brain, with computer science. And, I mean, how, like, what's the next data set that you're looking at? Like, are you looking at open data with Twitter? There's just like so much data now, but you don't have those questionnaires kind of thing where it's like this is like, I mean, your data, it's really incredible. Like the difference, like, 10 different religions that people identify as. Like, where are you getting your data from now?
I actually have, I'll admit, first and foremost, I'm a generalist and I try to study everything at the same time as much as I can. So when I have a project like this, it ends up kind of fading in and out of my immediate field of vision. I do have a paper under review with one of my colleagues who studied the Ogallala Aquifer in western Kansas and how people's religious views shaped their perception of water usage and shaped how they viewed environmental issues in this really drought-prone region. This was a fascinating project to work on, but again, he collected the data and I came in and did the analysis and built the theory around it. We got rejected by ASR, which is the top journal in sociology, but they gave us some good feedback, so I'm confident we're going to get published at some point in the near future. I'm also working on a project that deals with environmental valuation that gets into more of the sort of theoretical and qualitative aspects of this. That there's been this turn in environmental values. Philosophy has often defined environmental issues as being, is the environment intrinsically valuable and we have some duty to protect it, or is the environment instrumentally valuable? Like this sort of utilitarian versus deontological separation. We've been thinking more and more, and by we I mean a lot of people who do environmental values kind of research, about changing the discourse, looking for sort of a third way, looking for sort of a relational environmental valuation, that we build our ideas about environmental valuation by interacting with the environment over time, right? Not only individually, but culturally, collectively as a group. And I'm going to see where that goes. We're going to present at MSS in Chicago in a couple of weeks, and I'll see where that goes from there.
We're having beers.
That's a cool idea. I mean, I can't help but like my personal anecdotes against this extinction kind of narrative that I'm trying to reframe climate change as. I mean, I think about, when I'm snorkeling in San Diego and there was, no stellar sea cow there. And stellar sea cow was basically the manatee of the Pacific Ocean. And they've been extinct within like 16 years of humans discovering them. And it's just so sad that I got that experience of snorkeling and seeing a stellar sea cow was just, and giant bass and all these other animals just was completely removed from me, and I wasn't able to have that experience. And I think about when I drive cross country, and I think about like all these plants that I'm passing, and I don't see any herbivores. I see no animal life whatsoever. It just blows my mind. Like it just can't be how it should be, right? That there has to be like herbivores that should be eating these plants. Like there's just, I don't know. It's just this great vacancy throughout nature right now. It's just puts a hole in me. I can't. I don't know. I think about it all the time.
So I just want to point something out, Greg. You should be a freaking teacher in higher ed, because like you come at this biology stuff with this fantastic, wonderful, like joyous kind of emotion. Sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that too, right? Going back to the point about the stories we tell, having that kind of energy really, I think, creates an air of, I guess, genuity. You're very genuine when you tell these stories or ask your questions, and I think that's like something to take advantage of, right? Like when you're having these conversations with people, Greg, like that's how you come across. You're serious, you're genuine, like you don't really have any ulterior motive. And if we're talking about how we try and tell better stories to help, in this particular circumstance, that religious folks start to be more aware of the environment that they are living in, then yeah, absolutely, like that's the energy you kind of want to harness. Like you don't want to come across as, in a negative way. So I think that's a very salient observation from Professor Q.
Yeah, again, I'm at a weird crossroads, so I'm thinking about these things, and I just see like, I'm like, why isn't this guy in higher ed? I would love to have this guy as a colleague.
Yeah, that doesn't other issues, but yeah, thank you.
Well, I think it speaks to kind of why we have this segment in the first place, right? Like a lot of the people we deal with in higher ed really seem to not have this, fundamental interest in either continuing education or really just doing anything outside of their sphere. So this is why this is at least a little refreshing, right? I never really would have conceptualized any of this, but now I have at least a lot of food for thought, if not, sort of, I guess, an improvement in communication strategy, depending on who I'm talking to.
Well,
yeah.
Speaking of the stories we tell, or stories that we want to tell, or the stories that we want religious institutions and communities to tell, do we want them to, continue to rely on this kind of instrumentalist kind of view that the environment is here for our purposes, our needs as humans? Going back to the anthropocentric thing, is it an instrumental thing that we're doing about the environment, or are we treating the environment as something that is intrinsically valuable? And how do we do that? I think
go ahead, sorry.
That's kind of where we want to get to, but I don't know for sure.
I mean, if they're seeing it as an instrumental way of thinking, like meet them where they are. Take better care of your instruments. Maintain your instrument. Restring your instrument. Retune that thing.
We'll see, but what if God will simply deliver more onto you without any extra effort?
I mean,
Oops.
That's the thing, man. Without a progressive representative like Catholicism or Shia Islam, I feel like it's really hard for people. I mean, they can basically read into whatever they want, right? They can read into whatever stories and highlight whatever stories they want, and I do agree that there has been, if someone's highly religious in the United States, like there's a 99% chance I know exactly how you feel about like on 100 different issues. and there has been like a lot of pastors pushing religion in the, and I think that's been really negative. So.
Well, yeah, I think there's also something to be said about that. Like when you talk about pastors, there's almost sort of like a power mapping that goes into that, right? If we're talking about how to sort of enter the religious sphere to, I don't know, I don't want to use the word propagandize because that almost has a negative connotation, but it almost kind of is propagandizing, like to really inoculate these folks against the idea that we shouldn't do anything, right? To really, spread a, I guess, more religiously themed message about being concerned about the environment. Like, those are the people you want to target, because those are the people that have influence, right? Pastors, I don't know if imams would necessarily like fall into the same category if we're talking about other religions, but people who have these positions of prominence within institutions or communities. It doesn't have to be Joel Osteen or some sort of TV evangelist, but it could be your local preacher who does the Sunday service for a rural church and in a remote part of Texas or Mississippi or something where they have 20, 30 congregants max. Like, there's still a value in talking to those people.
I think the issue too is the sort of shifting the mindset, right? Shifting away from sort of top-down mindset, that what we need to do is convince the leaders so that they can steer the flock in the right direction, right? That puts us in a weird place as scholars and as thinkers, in terms of we assume we have a great deal of agency, and we assume that the people we're trying to communicate with, their agency is extremely constrained, which in reality we're not. We're much more similar than different, right? Even if we disagree on all kinds of issues in a fundamental sense, okay, this is my humanism coming through, right? But even if we disagree in fundamental sense, we're still people. We still have to find ways to live together and deal with our collective problems, right? This is where I see sort of relationality coming in, that rather than valuing environmentalism as sort of an outcome of power, where both duty and instrumentalism to some extent seem like a result of they're an outcome of power, right? They're a result of a power over the environment. How could we build a relationship not only with the environment through ongoing interaction, but with other people who are different from us and who see the environment differently from us through ongoing interaction? That's really, I think, what pushes me forward, and really where I started to rethink some of these things from a smaller scale, really.
Yeah.
I guess that maybe sounds a little bit anarchistic too, but I don't apologize for that. So.
No,
No,
it's
I mean,
true.
like, hey, shout out to the anarchists. It kind of seemed like my immediate thought in what you're talking about, of like, how do we, bridge those two, like, environmental activists to like congregations. My immediate thing is like direct action, things like, oh, we're planting trees, oh, we're like cleaning up litter or whatever it is, like those kinds of things, getting like congregations involved in the process. That's a direct way of like drawing a human line between those two camps.
Yeah. Not to, I mean, I sound quaint, but yeah, we can work together to solve our problems once we see they're right in front of our faces, right? There's at least the potential to do that.
We do have a question from chat if you want to take a question from the audience.
Sure, happy to.
If we're talking about the sacred versus mundane, is it a winning strategy to make stuff sacred or to diffuse sacredness as a prerequisite to respect?
That's a great question.
Yeah, big brain.
And this is something I think about, and this is actually one of my dissertation committee members raised this point. Are you talking about religion, or are you talking about the sacred? And if you're talking about the sacred as something that's set apart from the worldly, that can create other kinds of problems, right?
Interesting.
When we think about, we talked about the Rooseveltian strategy, right? The national park strategy.
Yeah.
We're gonna set aside these places from human interference. There's something very colonialist about that, right? In the sense that you have first peoples who lived on a lot of these lands for thousands of years in relative harmony before settlers showed up, and then said, no, we need to keep these free of human influence. And if you're an indigenous person, I can see where you'd say, well, wait a minute, we've been living here for thousands of years, we didn't have problems. The problems are you coming in, killing all the buffalo, running this train through here, pushing these ecosystems onto these little archipelagos, as you said, Greg. There is a problematic dimension of the sacred too, that I think doesn't get talked about often enough, when not only in environmentalism discourse, but when we start to think about religion and some of the impacts that religion can have. I see and try to see religion as potentially having a lot of positive and a lot of negative impacts, right? Because I think it does. It reflects the flaws of the humans who build the institution, like any other institution. So setting something aside as sacred can be a really good thing or a really bad thing, right? And we can definitely see how that might feed into some of these environmental discourses. That makes sense.
That's a good answer, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, even
That's
like
such a
to get
cool
at the
idea.
other end of that too. Like, I think the second part of the question was, do we try to diffuse the notion of sacred in order to try and hyper secularize everything? And I think that that analysis almost kind of like invalidates itself, just because it brings us back to like what we said at the very start of this. There's this culture war notion that everything you believe in with respect to your religious values is being torn asunder by society. So if you're trying to, remove their ability to think of something as sacred, or to try and, convince them to look at something from a very hyper secular point of view, you're kind of going back to that like information deficit model, just throwing information and stats at them, and that's really not going to work, and it's going to run counter to what they believe. So that's a really like difficult question, because it almost seems like there's really no right answer, but at some point in the conversation there just has to be an answer or a strategy.
I think that's an aspect of cultural competency too, right? That we have to try to understand what other people take to be sacred, even if we don't take that to be sacred, when we try to communicate across cultural barriers, right? Which in a sense is part of this conversation.
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and just check in with you, Dr. Schroet. How are you doing on time? How are you feeling so far?
I've had a really long week and I'm really tired, but I'm having a lot of fun, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, no worries. You can definitely feel free to chime in if you feel like you need to bounce. We obviously want to be very respectful of your time, and I certainly empathize with the long week, and it's still not over. We have one more day, so. Yeah, let me guess. I just pose a question to the rest of the ministry here. Does anybody have any like lingering thoughts that they've wanted to address, or any other questions from respective chats?
I'm probing my chat.
Hopefully not in the alien way.
While we're waiting on chat, I did just hear something, and this is maybe an unfair question to ask you, but have you heard that there's like a movement in cities like Atlanta to annex themselves away from Atlanta? And like, I'm kind of putting this out there as like, hey, this may be something we want to like look at long term about this kind of reformation of cities, because I've been looking at some interesting stuff coming out of urban sociology, and it's suggesting that there's like maybe a move, and then how would that impact your research?
It's a good question. I think there is this sort of consciousness right now, big picture wise, just pulling away from bigness, and to some extent, I see this on the left and the right. That you have the United States has 250 million people in it, right? Or I'm sorry, 1/3 of a billion people, and we have 333 million people in this country. That's a huge, huge country, and we're still running it like a democracy, at least in theory. How does it? I say it is in theory.
Yeah. Good
Yeah.
qualifier there. Good qualifier.
How do you run a democratic, even ostensibly democratic state of 1/3 of a billion people from some centralized governing structure? And I could ask that same question when I talk about Atlanta. How many people live in the greater Atlanta area? I don't know off the top of my head, but are you going to be able to make policies in which there aren't a bunch of clear winners, a bunch of clear losers, when you have a huge population of people in an area like that? People get tired of being on the losing end of policy over and over again, and at some point they will have had enough. We're not being listened to. We're getting run over by these policies, and we're not going to take it anymore, right? Trying to be sympathetic at the same time as some of the outcomes of that discourse get ugly sometimes, right? When you feel like you're not being represented in the political process, and you say, march to Washington and break into Congress and try to, end the certification of the next president, for example. How do you manage bigness and democracy at the same time? This is the question I get from the insight you pointed to, Chris, and I'd love to do more work on that because I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Or at least,
a great part. One of the big problems of democracy is tyranny of the majority. There's the majority voting against the minority and holding that power, and then environmental issues is another. Goes into tragedy of the commons, which is the other large political science, problem with democracy as well. So, kind of like some issues are uniquely at the center of both, and I feel like the environmental problem is because the people that really care about the environment and care about the future humans on this world, we are the minority, the vast minority, and the environment that is dying off right now is it's just a tragedy that nobody cares about that.
it's depressing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. I just had a follow up. I'll let you respond.
It's depressing to think about, and not only to think about, maybe there aren't that many people who are invested in the future survival of our species, right? Which is a huge thing to even think about being invested in. But I've had these conversations in the past with smart people across different disciplines who arrive at the conclusion essentially that we're fucked, right? Not to put too fine a point out, I think that's the right academic language for this. That
Yeah.
arrive at the conclusion that these environmental issues are so big and so intractable that we're going to continue to rearrange chairs as the Titanic sinks until the Titanic sinks, right? I don't think that's true. If I thought that was true, I wouldn't do the work that I do, right? I don't know what I'd do. Maybe I'd go buy some land north of here and try to hide from the fallout or something. Maybe I'd
Move to
better
the
at
boundary
fishing.
waters.
Yeah. Maybe I just go fishing. I've always joked about that with my students. I'd study society. If society collapses, I'll go grab my fishing pole and get out of here. Right?
Study
Then we
fish
rest.
populations.
You joke, but
Yeah.
there is a sociologist who did just that, by the way.
Yeah.
He's kind of an interesting guy. I'll just leave it at that.
I do have two questions. If Marcus, you had a follow up, if we want to do that, and then we'll go into the final questions from chat.
Sure. Mine, I think, is kind of a little bit of a niche question, and I think since we've expressed at least some anarchist sympathies, I feel comfortable asking this because I have a lot of other graduate student colleagues here, and they're very crusty anarchists. So I'm kind of interested just in your take on this. Something that they promote, and I think this is, I don't know how much it's growing, but I don't know if you're familiar with the degrowth movement at all. Sort of this concept of just re-examining one's individual relation to consumption and really thinking about do you need that extra insert thing here, and sort of not as a replacement for political action, but sort of on an individual level, kind of making a more critical analysis of the things that you buy and how desperately you actually need it. But that kind of made a connection in my brain when we're talking about religion, right? Because obviously, consumerism is a big no in religious texts. There's a lot of explicit condemnations of material worship over worship of insert deity here. So that almost kind of makes me wonder if one possible viable strategy would be to sort of emphasize that notion of hey, within the sphere of your religion, consumerism at mass is not something that's really prescribed. We should maybe try and stay true to this aspect of religious text. To me, I don't know, I think the higher order question is are there really any viable strategies to find immediate overlap in the text, or is this just more of a purely cultural thing? Do you think it's viable to point out points here in the Bible to be yeah, this is kind of why you should do it, or is it really just not that easy?
I think there's a bigger problem, and I think a really fascinating problem, and also a pretty intractable problem that comes out of this. And I'm thinking back all the way back to Max Weber, and the Protestant ethic, where he talks about the fact that, once basically he argues, if I'm sure most of you are familiar with his work, but if you're not, he basically argues that capitalism arises when and where it does because of these specific Protestant ideals. And some of these Protestant ideals that are actively condemning material wealth and actively condemning materialism lead to people who are looking for signs that they're going to be saved. I'm cartooning this a little bit, and they find those signs in their worldly ethic to work and to save their money and to be thrifty, to be hardworking, to not be indulgent. And what you get is this sort of the rational miser that Karl Marx talks about, right? Who makes money to reinvest money, to make money, to reinvest money, to make money. And Weber essentially argues, once the genie's out of the bottle, once the capitalist genie's out of the bottle, the Protestant ethic is no longer needed, right? That what Western civilization has essentially done over the course of this is created a new religion, the religion of growth. You might say the religion of growth, the religion of instrumentalism, the religion of capitalism, if you like, right? And I think if you're pushing back against that, you're fighting upstream, even if you're doing it in a church. Especially if you go to California, you go to a mega church in California that has fast food restaurants in it, right? That looks like a mall inside. Especially if you're talking about, and I try not to do theological interpretation because I'm not a theologian, but if you're talking about the prosperity gospel, right, that comes out of the positive thinking movement, the positive psychology movement, that you can get rich and famous and blessed if you just change your thinking process and give yourself to the church, give yourself to what we're doing here. That the outcome becomes worldly wealth, worldly pleasure. It becomes growth. It feeds into this sort of machine, right? I feel like I might get cranky if I keep talking in this direction too much more. But there, I think there are spaces to do this, but I read folks like Paul Kingsnorth. He wrote a book. It's a collection of essays, Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. He's a big degrowth guy. He's very critical of technology, and he moved out into the woods and shits in a bucket now, right? And he thinks, okay, not to put too fine a point on
full
it, but
return to monkey.
About to say.
And he's going to sit out in the woods and he's going to shit in a bucket and he's going to watch civilization burn around him, right? Because he doesn't think that we're going to be able to extricate ourselves from this machine that we've built. Again, I don't want to sound apocalyptic because I'm not. I'm a pretty optimistic guy on a day-to-day basis, but I think if you're going to advocate for degrowth, religious or secular, I think you're pushing upstream against some pretty powerful cultural momentum. And I'm sure
that makes sense.
Sure, the anarchist-oriented folks who are in the audience probably have experienced this or feel this way, right? We're surrounded by things that want to push our dopamine buttons. Buy this, get this, eat this, drink that, wear that, right? Constantly. Even more so now that we have social media, now that we have the internet. This is my first time on social media since November. I gave it up because I thought it was messing with my head too much, honestly.
Healthy impulse.
Dude,
Yeah, there are
honestly,
lots of people on the platform that need to do that. We call it touching grass.
Yes, but Twitch has been great for me in a different way because I've found community and everything. But yeah, you're totally right about social media. Burn it all down.
Well, I mean, you reflected on it in your essay on your webpage, where you introduced yourself and you went through this kind of personal degrowth, then elimination of the social media and elimination of all these consumerist types of things to something a little bit more simple and a little bit more human focused and human centered. And I really loved that essay. I thought it was brilliant.
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, that's my April blog entry. I wasn't sure if anybody read it yet. I'm glad you did, and I really appreciate it. I think to your point, if I'm going to be constructive, I'd say, yeah, if you want to think about degrowth, you have to train yourself to think small. You have to put yourself in that mindset, right? And that mindset includes sort of stepping back from. I'm a grand theorist. I'm teaching theory in the morning, so this is hard for me as anybody. But right, stepping back from the tendency to sort of theorize and try to practice in little iterative, gradual ways what it is you want to do, right? What kind of world you want to live in? How can I do something? How can I chip away just a little bit at the things that I think are problematic? And it's been pretty fulfilling, right? As I've slowly started to try to do this a little bit more, as I slowly started to think, okay, I live too big too. I go out to eat too much. I spend too much time on social media. I think my biggest buying habit is books, but I think I'm in good company that way.
Yeah, I
You're
think
propping a big book, brother.
the biggest problem with like social media is that it removes our ability to decide what we want to see. And I think that stepping back and saying like this, I'm gonna choose to ignore this. I'm gonna choose to ignore this. I'm gonna focus my attention on a particular thing. I mean, I think that's too many people think that they can hyper multitask, and so it's good to limit. I feel like have an editor.
Ooh, one day we'll get one. So if you want to kind of maybe give us a little hopium with this next question, it's very easy in this next question to take the doom pill. But I have two, but one of them is more COVID related, so we'll save that for the post guest segment. The question from chat was, what do you think? What do you all think will be the main bridging factor between atheist, spiritual, and theist that will bring us together, or will starvation and climate refugees be the wake-up call?
I take a page. I take a page from the work of Ulrich Beck, Risk Society. The book is really it's a hard read. It took me a while, even toward the end of my PhD, to get through it. But he has this idea that modern society, in its bigness, in its runaway growth, has given rise to all kinds of hazards like poverty, like refugee crises, like runaway climate change. And he holds out the hope for more authentically democratic political space. I don't mean democratic as in the party, I mean authentically democratic political space to emerge to confront these problems, because they are so big and they impact so many of us in so many different ways, that we will start to rethink politics from the ground up. I don't know if I'd call Beck an anarchist. I think he would have identified as more of a democratic socialist like John Dewey. But I do see some elective affinity for rethinking at the small scale some of these huge and intractable problems, such that maybe we can, if not overcome our differences, maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, be able to learn from our differences and be able to collaborate constructively across those differences, maybe a better way to think about it. Is that a good dose of hopium for us?
I think so.
I mean, especially democratic approaches when it comes to the internet. I mean, I feel like all politics has to be rethought because of the internet. That's such a huge moment in human evolution, in my opinion. That the ability for populations now to all have their voices be heard instantaneously on any issue. Maybe it's not every issue that you vote on, and every day you're not voting on like, should the United States exist as a country? Some stuff you shouldn't vote on constantly, but maybe big issues and stuff that would be a really interesting idea to work that into politics more, or even at the local level, getting more connected to what's happening at City Hall and zoning commissions. Let's bring it back to environmentalism. The ability for you to say, hey, I care about this issue. What's happening in my area that impacts this, and what can I do to help? It's like it gives you a calendar event. Like, hey, there's an event this week that's City Hall is talking about this zoning issue that's going to impact this fish that's indigenous to your area, and if it dies, then it dies. and connect more people better.
Yeah. The stakeholder approach, I'm thinking now suddenly of participant action research, right? The idea that we as academics can collaboratively construct problems with communities based on what they actually need by participating with them in the process. I'm far, admittedly, as somebody who sits at a computer and crunches numbers all day, from being able to regularly do that. But I think it's a nice idea, and I think there's a lot of hope for that possibility.
I agree. This is actually my nonprofit idea. If anyone wants to work with me on it, this is what I'm doing. Or if you want to steal it. It's a good idea, in my opinion. Every research institution should be connected with their nearest city hall. Their city hall has problems that are, happening every day, that they realize that they need researched ideas, that they have observations that they need the science in order to back it up. And the scientist then also needs these stories and this research to be done for grants. All of the NSF, all that kind of stuff. They really love these community to science connections, and I feel like creating a bridge where you can bridge city halls research problems to local universities and research institutions would be so interesting. Like, for example, in my area, a city hall problem that I never thought would come up is basically when the fire engines turn on, like where do they go and how do they go? My immediately would be like, oh, Google Maps. Well, I mean, when you have the ability to have all the lights turned green, it's kind of like an interesting problem. Then now we can actually go a lot of different areas a lot quicker. And they actually pose this problem to like an engineering fair. And anyway, it's just like, it's really interesting that when you have that pipeline and you have that question led ability, you get some weird questions that are really interesting scientifically.
Like a integrated civil infrastructure project.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So, okay, we do have one funny question.
I don't know if it's the one we're thinking of.
Not the usual one.
Okay.
So a lot of people talk about cow flatulence as, a contributor to climate change. And so someone in our chat asked what your thoughts are on that. And I don't know.
Holy shit, if you will.
That's a good
Thank
one.
you. Thank you.
I don't think any further words are required. We just cut it there. Cut the mics.
I'm not a chemist, but technically, doesn't all flatulence contain methane?
Yeah, it's just, it happens.
Yeah.
It's because of the rumination of the gut and the double gut that they have, and they release more. Yeah.
And yeah, that's. I mean, if I'm gonna take seriously cows, right? We've bred large numbers of cows to feed our appetite for beef. And I'll be the first to admit I like to have a nice steak once in a while, right? I'm not a vegetarian, but I also know that beef is pretty hard on the environment, not just because of cow parts. Land use change around ranching is a big contributor to climate change. It's a big contributor to extinction of species, deforestation. These farming and ranching processes pollute waterways. And again, when I say this, I don't want to demonize farming and ranching, because that's where our food comes from, right? We live in a technological society. We don't grow our own food. And the last thing I would want to do is start to implicate the people who feed me in the problem first and foremost, right? You don't want to do that, because that's, dumb, right? But our diet, our lifestyle, not just the US, but the so-called Western diet, does weigh pretty heavily on the environment. If I'm going to take that question seriously, but yeah, I think all farts have methane in them, and so technically we're all contributing to climate change, right?
That would be democratically taking his question and making it a little bit more serious. But
That was the
Restructuring.
charitable interpretation.
Oh, I love
All right.
love questions, even troll questions. I don't know if that was a troll question or a serious question, but I'm glad somebody brought it up because it's something that gets
Mostly troll with an undercurrent of might be serious. But no, we love the human being who asked that question in chat. We're used to very differently themed questions coming from him. But all that to say, this might be a pretty good stopping point to at least wrap up the guest portion. So, Dr. Schroet, go ahead and give us any parting thoughts, or if you want to go ahead and plug your book again, or plug any other stuff you got going on, any causes you'd like to just kind of broadcast into the ether. Now's your time.
Sure. So I do have my book, Faiths in Green, Religion, Environmental Change, and Environmental Concern in the United States. Came out last year. You can buy it on my website. Signed copy, $10 off the retail price, which is expensive. And honestly, I'm hoping to sell enough of these to get it in paperback later. It's available at many libraries. If it's not available at your library, please request it. I'm sure that Lexington Books would be happy to send one along their way if they're willing to purchase one, so that you don't have to pay the full price for the hardcover. I have a blog. My name, lucasschroet.com. I have my own website. I have a blog. I contribute to it monthly. I also contribute practical stuff in terms of teaching. I teach social movements. I teach statistics. I've been doing a series of webinars in different places on how to get an academic job, how to better apply for an academic job. If there are people who are grad students in the audience who are nervous about that process, I was on the job market for several years. I have also been on the other side of the table where I get to hire people, so I can give you a lot of advice. Feel free to take a look at any of that. I always have a lot of irons in the fire. I study science education. I study these issues related to morality, religion, and culture and environment quite a bit. And I guess last thing to say, I'm just really grateful to be here. Thank you, Professor Q, for the invitation. I'm happy to have gotten to chat with everybody today. Thank you, Greg, Win-Win, Homozygote, and Gremlo for the discussion. It's been awesome. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much for your research. It was such a cool research area where I come in with a presupposition, an hypothesis, and you just smash it to pieces with great data and amazing science. And I loved reading it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Greg looks forward to that type of abuse each week. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I love having my mind changed. I really do. I love being wrong.
You made his week.
I really do love being wrong about stuff. And you're wow, you really changed my mind. So I thank you.
Thanks.
I was just gonna say this was an excuse for me to see your face because it's been so long. So, and I'll see you in a couple weeks, I guess.
Oh yeah. It's been great. Yeah, I'll see you at MSS.
Right on. So I guess without any further ado, again, Dr. Schroet, thank you so much for your time and thank you for being here. We all very much appreciate you and what you had to say and what you do. So we'll maybe see you another time. I think I would speak for all of us in saying the door is always open. So if there's another book you pump out or a really salient topic in your field that you'd like to come back and talk to us about another time, then we'd look forward to hearing that.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next time.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care. Alrighty, so now it's the five of us.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do now?
There was a question from chat.
Yeah, what do we do now?
It was like COVID related. If my biology
rock
bros
that.
want to try and hit this up. This was from Papadop, so a lot of the family will know who he is. Question relating COVID: is it really advisable for the government to have some countries being lenient with the face masks and all? With the fact that there are some countries that have bad, this is like a ESL, had a bad record of lowering the COVID cases, especially in Asia.
Okay, so I think what the question's asking is is it a good idea to take all of our masks off right now with the hyper variability of a particular country's ability to deal with it? That might be stratified by geography, because at least right now, a lot of Asian countries are having their first surge. You look at South Korea, you look at Hong Kong, some of the countries in Southeast Asia are having really big Omicron 2 spikes right now, despite their ability to keep it relatively under control prior to now. I think across the board, no, nobody really, at least in my opinion, should be taking their masks off right now, nor lifting any precautions. I can actually say I had this discussion with my research advisor today because we have an unmasked lab meeting tomorrow with like 11 plus people, where at least in my city, the wastewater levels of virus are going back up again. Surprise, timed perfectly with removing the mask mandate a week ago. A lot of other grad students are saying half their class that they teach is just out sick with COVID again. So it really, I think, just it's common sense for people who've really been paying attention and have a desire to like not get sick. I think we're really seeing economy finally regain its stranglehold over policy making within the public health sphere. So I think other countries are kind of following suit with the West. China, I think, being the largest exception, because right now they just locked down Shanghai, and that I think is going to have some economic ripple effects, because that's obviously such a massive production and shipping hub. I think within the last week. I don't know how long the lockdown is going to last, but that's how seriously they take it, right? China generally has a zero tolerance approach where, if they see traces or hints of it, they'll, start welding apartment doors shut, lock down an entire province or city, fire the mayor, and then like try and clean up the mess and contain the cases. I don't know how accurate the data is necessarily with case counts, and I think that's always been a concern from the start with respect to what's happening in China. But at least at face value, they do try and take it a bit more seriously than the West. So yeah, generally speaking, what you're seeing right now is the West saying, we're done, we're moving on, we have to get the economy back in order before midterms, at least if you're an American. So that seems to be the situation, and we're going to have at least a rebound surge, if not a full-blown sixth wave, I think, as a consequence.
I was reading that they're making Chinese stockbrokers stay in their offices.
Oh yeah, and they'll listen, because if they don't, they'll get Jack Mod, and they won't be in their office for a very long time, or anywhere else really. They'll get the disappearing treatment. So that's how seriously they take it. And I think China
you stay in a hotel for a week, and maybe have a greater appreciation for the CCP.
Not a hotel, but in their office. It's crazy, man.
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, a billionaire's office compared to some of the cubbies that all of us have lived in or currently live in, like, it's certainly probably a little bit more lavish in some respects. But at the same time, again, I think it speaks to like that degree of accountability. That's something we've all like wanted to see. Like the politicians in both parties, in the UK and in the US, like. The Tories have had their COVID parties. They tell everybody else to stay home. They lock everything down. And then Boris and all of their Republican friends go hang out and party over Christmas. Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi and all of the big Democratic names, they all go out and have parties, eat at restaurants and stuff like that, while telling everybody else to stay home. I think there's actually kind of a degree of accountability that people want to see in relation to that. So it's at least nice to see that China's trying to be a little bit more consistent about it. They still might not be perfect, but I think they're doing a better job than we are.
Yeah. Mitch came in clutch with an article. National Health Commission said 3,507 new locally spread cases had been identified in the last 24-hour period, up from the 1,337 a day earlier. So a major spike. While the numbers are low compared to elsewhere in the world, more than 10,000 cases China recorded in the first 2 weeks of March far exceed previous flare-ups.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to the nature of how quickly the virus has evolved and continues to evolve. I mean, if you really go into the universe that I delve into constantly on COVID Twitter, you see people looking at individual changes in like individual letters in the virus's genetic code, and how that like has such a massive transmission advantage versus like the previous version of the virus, which is all under the umbrella of Omicron. Like we're so far down the rabbit hole in terms of viral evolution that even the most like strict policies really can't just keep it out. China being one of the countries that has one of the most strict policies across any nation anywhere on Earth. So yeah, that's not surprising, because Omicron subvariant BA2 is the most contagious damn version of it to date. And hopefully we can do a better job so we don't have another one to talk about and ask this question about again for like the nth time in the last like 2+ years.
Ooh, like it is fascinating how the media diluting the COVID stuff, because what have we had in the last 3 months? Ukraine, SCOTUS, and like one other thing. The media cycle's so rapid right now. I can't wait to see what it's going to look like during the primaries. God, I can't wait for the primaries to start. It's going to be so content.
It's going to be primo content. And you actually touch on something interesting, because a lot of the conspiracy theorists, they're like stuck on COVID. Like they can't handle multiple world crises happening at the same time. So
Right.
you hear a lot of
That's the
conspiracy
NWO,
theorists saying
dude.
like, yeah, like the NWO started the war in Ukraine on purpose to distract from the next COVID variant and the microchips that are coming in, the boosters for that new variant or something. Like,
What is this
I've seen a lot of that.
biolab thing that the right, conspiratorial right is doing, like with Ukraine? Is it like, okay, the biolabs in Ukraine have a connection to Hunter Biden? Is it like, am I drawing a thread here?
Well, that was Trump just said that recently, right? He's asking Putin to release stuff that shows their connection. So,
Yeah,
Well, if it
clearly,
comes out of Trump's mouth, you know it's got to be verifiable.
Yeah.
very well researched.
yeah, Trump
Yeah.
figured out that Hunter Biden's laptop is secretly hiding under a lab bench in a Ukrainian biolab somewhere. That's why Russia needs to invade it and therefore find its contents. Like, everybody's just shoehorning everything right now into the biolab shit. Like, that's why I still want to talk to, I think it was Rhizome, like you were telling me before, Gremlo, because like it's kind of funny. Like, they want to have like a panel over it, and it's such a boring, like not exciting truth that I don't see how you can have a panel over it. It's just so plain and
They're
boring.
fucking crazy, man. They want to have a panel. Like what?
Okay,
Content
so
brain, man.
I don't know if Mythic is still in chat. He might be like lurking in one of ours, or he might be over at Rhizomes. I had a conversation, and I have been having a conversation over the last couple days about this, about like the content skull that people within Twitch poll have. Greg, you got a good eye for it, but we may need to have a intervention about your other person you want to talk to off stream. It's spectacle, right? It's where the audience goes, and this conversation with Haas about Biolab, that's just content. There's no like, we're gonna correct the record for this, right? It's literally like the spectacle of like making fun of this ridiculous notion.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like it's an issue that could be explained with like 15 minutes just to explain some definitions and like one article that basically points out like if it was an actual bioweapon production facility, like the buildings would look so different. You could just see it with a satellite or like with your own two eyes. Like the labs that they have there are like the Ukrainian equivalent of like academic research labs like Greg and I work in. Like that's really it. That's as far as the conspiracy really goes. Like they're just public health laboratories designed to like run diagnostic tests and maybe handle anything if there was any qualm of Russia like using a bioweapon on Ukraine. Then they had laboratories there to like handle patient samples to try and study it, and that was funded largely by the U.S. Department of Defense, I think.
Right. This is for like if there's like a cholera outbreak or something like
cholera. I think there's like some regional like pig virus that interestingly enough is named after like an African pig, so it's like an African swine virus in like Russia / Ukraine. So the geography gets confusing because scientists suck at naming things, but it's just handling like local environmental illness. Like that's all those labs are designed to do, is that plus like the general public health needs of the Ukrainian population. Like that.
And
that's
it makes sense that someone who's doing Westoid Anglo propaganda would say.
I mean, the problem with the biolab stuff too is that it encompasses so many different choose your own adventure kind of like conspiracies. So it's like the intentional versus the unintentional leaking of this thing, the bioterrorist weapon that is or isn't being done, whether or not the people that are running it are connected to whose government. And it's like we're talking about like 15 different combinations that could happen, and everyone's kind of bringing on different parts, whether or not you think the NWO is running this or if it's an accidental leak by the person. It's just there's so many different combinations, and it gets all wrapped up, and it's just it's an extension of the lab leak hypothesis basically.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to know, I think I literally just said this in my chat, but Russia's been pushing this shit since long before COVID started. They've been saying in a variety of different ways, it's kind of this like conspiracy theory counter to counter the whole like NATO expansionist mentality of, you're on our doorstep and you're like secretly making bioweapons to hurt Russian people. That's bad. We'd go away and get your military bases and your totally non-existent bio labs out of our face. Like, they've been pushing that since long before COVID started. And anybody who's like seriously pushing that now is simply just regurgitating propaganda in an effort to like justify the invasion of Ukraine, to cozy up to Russia, both, or just out of sheer ignorance as to what the hell is actually going on.
So I want to ask you, Marcus, and you, Greg, this question, which may steer it back over to where Grimlow may be trying to angle this. Do you think panels like that actually improve the dialogue, or do they just further promote conspiracy? Because I have my own opinions on this, but I feel like that just gives oxygen to this notion.
Yeah, I would say it promotes conspiracy outright, simply because we can bring this back to Brandolini's law. It takes so much effort and energy for someone like me or Greg, a biologist, to drop our pipettes, get out of our laboratories, log on main, and call out this bullshit for exactly what it is. And by the time that happens, everybody's moved on to the next content skull idea. We already have 3 more panels being assembled to propagate even more stuff just for content, without any really regard to what the consequences might be. And what I foresee the logical consequences of that being, or the continued amplification of anti-science sentiment. Right, there's a very real and legitimate and humanitarian purpose to those biolabs in Ukraine. If we're using that as an example, like, that is objectively good, and I would be in further support of giving more money to these labs, because it has a very positive material impact on the people of Ukraine. They can get medical care more effectively. They can do antibiotic sensitivity experiments on people's bacterial infections to actually treat them well. Like, basic medical care is afforded to them because of the presence of these US-funded, Ukrainian-run laboratories. So, when you start putting the idea in people's brains that like these are actually bad, which I think a former ambassador to Ukraine, I think it was Victoria Nuland, like literally did that in Congress, like talking to Republicans. Then you're creating this, demand from within the US to like cut off funding to that, which is only going to hurt people in Ukraine. The very people that we're trying to say, we support you, we want to hug and kiss you and give you a javelin missile so you can fight back, you brave patriot. So, at the end of the day, at least for me, like, it's disrespectful to the biology and almost to the people that we're trying to say we like, to give oxygen to a notion like this, simply because it's boring. Like, this is just people making shit up. You're literally taking state invented propaganda and taking it from people who are not mentally correct, not mentally right, like they need help, and just turning it into content. And that, I think, is like a big issue on the platform specifically. That's just my soliloquy. Greg, do you have any additional thoughts?
So in my opinion, biologists are already not engaging. Scientists are already not engaging. So that's the default, in my opinion. I think that a lot of these conspiracies are the product of social media and algorithms pushing these things, pushing these ideas. So I don't think that these panels are a source of the conspiracy. I think the danger of it is that, like, for example, my discussion with Haas, the danger of that is that someone could take that afterwards and be like, well, he talked to a scientist. Scientist didn't change his mind. Therefore, now Haas's idea that DNA isn't able to be used, isn't the sole carrier of inheritance, is now legitimized more because now he's talked to a scientist. In my opinion, like, me being able to go on Haas's stream, and if he asked me about another science question to have me on, I would say yes, because if it's not necessarily Haas that I'm talking to, it's people in his chat, on YouTube, that would be searching for these ideas, and now they actually see someone that's engaging in them, respectfully taking them on, just like maybe they're ruminating these ideas in their own mind, and now they're seeing like, oh, there is a legitimate answer to this. I don't have to go down this populist right radicalization pipeline, or maybe I don't have to go down this conspiracy theory in order to think that, like, okay, there's biology labs everywhere, that's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, so I think like maybe these aren't necessarily like comparable. Like I didn't have any problems with the conversation you had with Haas. I think that was ultimately probably a good thing. I think that was a very like niche set of beliefs that he had with respect to DNA. Right, that's not something that's very widely held, even in like a conspiratorial realm. That's really just somebody trying to be a tanky. To adopt Lysenkoism as an unironic like philosophy in current year. So that I think was fine. I think where like the line kind of has to be drawn with respect to like do we engage versus do we not engage is when we're talking about something with respect to the biolab situation. Like it's been debunked for years. It's like 3 Google clicks away. Like the barrier to anybody in the audience like fact checking this for themselves is so painfully low. They could literally Google it, find the page on the US State Department website that says here's why we're funding these labs and here's what they do, and then be satisfied with that. Like it shouldn't take a massive dialectical back and forth between whoever's talking about all of this and a conspiracy theorist who's propping up this actual conspiracy to really like debunk it. I think all of that to say there's probably some context dependency on the issue. Like if there's harm that could be delivered by talking about something, then it might not be a bad idea to like speak to the room, even if you're not changing the beliefs of the people spreading whatever conspiracy you're talking about. But you really have to be judicious about it, simply because there are an abundance of people, I think, not in good faith online, and they'll jump on whatever the flavor of the month is. I think this month it just happened to be Ukrainian biolabs, and that's kind of where I wonder, like, okay, what's Hod's going to say next with respect to biology or DNA or something like that? And then we're just rinsing and repeating once a month based off of what someone who's not mentally healthy is going to say. So I guess Professor Q, that's just where I stand. Greg?
Like I agree with you, Marcus, in that. But the problem is like even in your story of people doing their own research for primary sources, they're landing on a state.gov website and they're having to trust that. And even on this panel and in our discussions as friends, we've talked about our own and we all know about the problems with the state government, the United States pushing narratives and that not being necessarily a trustworthy source. I would agree with you that that's a good source, and maybe that we should push farther into that, the actual report and what the state government is actually citing as evidence. For example, like the lab leak hypothesis, that big bombshell paper that came out of the House Republicans. You read that thing, it was like 120 pages, but it was all just opinions. You like this DOD scientist says that there's a strong possibility that this could have happened. It's like sequences. How are you talking about biology and phylogenetics without looking at sequences and actual biology? They just didn't have it, and I think you have to do like fact check even the state basically, and that with transparency you can actually see sometimes when it just doesn't make any sense.
Oh yeah, of course. Like obviously, the State Department is not the Bible or the gospel by any stretch. But I think what you're speaking to is just like there is, of course, a need to like ascertain what the situation is, and then we can broadcast that. But I think there comes a point where even if you're trying to like speak to a particular audience, that they're simply there for their streamer, and their minds aren't necessarily open for that conversation, as we talked about in the philosophy of science class, that conversion, right? Like, it almost seems arbitrary sometimes how we like win over people to actually take scientific fact seriously and sort of prioritize it over other sources of information that they're receiving about insert issue here. So, I'm not necessarily sure, without like actually seeing some statistics, how, genuinely effective it's going to be, especially because like what we do, Greg, like it's not the most exciting. I'm sorry, but people aren't lining up in a Twitch chat to hear everything about like the intimate details about how a BSL-2 laboratory in Ukraine functions, insofar as how it runs diagnostic tests. Like that is the most obscenely niche topic that's boring and everybody's not going to like it. But at the same time, Marcus, it's being weaponized.
But Marcus, if you wrapped it up in a WWE like wrapper and delivered it that way, wouldn't it be more effective? I think
the conspiracy is allowed and given air because people don't know. that's the thing, is that people don't know what it's like to be in a biology laboratory, how prevalent this is. You know,
I agree.
it allows, when you don't have that transparency, now you have people thinking that it's like really super rare and these biology lab in my neighborhood kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's also easier for like the average chatter to be like, wow, these biology labs, they sound kind of scary. They're doing like a gain of function research or other scary bioweapon stuff, versus like taking the time to actually sit down and understand. Like, I think the willingness to understand in sort of the Twitch Paul political chats, in a lot of them, is not there. I think that's my central thesis, is you're not necessarily talking to an audience who's there for the purpose of information or education. They want blood sports, they want content, they want to see their streamer epically own the other streamer in the free marketplace of ideas and make them quit the internet.
So
like,
you're saying that they're grifting?
WWE.
WWE, yeah.
You're saying that they're grifting and they don't actually believe this, and that they're holding these positions because they're trying to make content?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a grift. So it is a grift.
Most of it's a grift.
Interesting.
So in talking with a couple people who were in the space over the last couple of days, because I kind of got myself into some spicy drama, that is the space. You know, I've been told that the approach that we take here is too pure for this platform. It's too honest. It's too actual, like genuinely interested in, like, you know, coming to the right ideas and, you know, having an open discussion about
Love
these
that
things.
idea, Miller. Let's do it.
And that is not what the platform is. And I think there is an argument to be made about like meeting people where they're at. And if you have the chops, if you have like the rhetorical skills to be able to go into the WWE style thing, say all of this accurately, and get that epic that epic PogChamp dunk, well, that's great. But it does seem like a lot of it is just based around blood sport, and that having an actual honest conversation that's, you know, not under the guise of like, well, this is for the content, you know, I'm going to get a clip out of this, I'm going to make a segment out of this. Well, that's unfortunate, because that's unfortunately like not what Twitch is. And well, that's not true. Twitch has a space for that. Twitch politics is not it. Twitch politics is about like 8% of the platform, because Twitch politics and just chatting have like a little cross-pollination, but like people who exist in that space, it's like less than 12% of the platform. It's majority a gaming site.
Exactly.
So people come here for that, you know, spectacle. And I think if we're going to do that as like educators, academics, you know, science-minded people who want like the truth to be out there, don't want people to like dive into conspiracy theories, we have to rethink strategy in how we, you know, talk to people.
Well, in that light, then, I mean, if Twitch, it seems like I wonder if the environment of the website itself, the fact that Twitch has no search feature, it doesn't auto archive, your videos disappear after a certain amount of time. I wonder if that landscape selects for a more incendiary rhetoric, where people need to find your stream, watch it right now, it's going to go away, versus something like YouTube, where it's like, you know, someone that's more well researched and wants a more erudite conversation can search and find that and watch it on their own time and watch it, you know, weeks later.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, you can put that out there for the people who want it. I think what we're saying is like, that's a very small proportion of people relative to the total user base of the platform.
Of Twitch or of YouTube in general?
I mean, I'd say more so Twitch than YouTube, but I would still say overall for YouTube, it's a smaller proportion, because like a lot of like the YouTube quote unquote educational content, like to me, what I think of is sort of like the breadtube-esque like video essays and, you know, deep dives into a topic, which, yeah, I'm sure there is, I think, a space for science and scientists. I've definitely seen a bunch over COVID, like a bunch of actual scientists like can establish a presence and have done pretty well for themselves. I think there's a demand for it in some degree, but that demand is going to be dwarfed for, you know, the right-wing sphere, the entire algorithm pushing people towards, you know, the Alex Joneses, the Candace Owens, the, you know, established right-wing grifters. That content is always going to dominate the more genuine educational content, simply because the algorithm works in their favor. Right, you know, that's why you started to see people like Candace Owens. She literally has a 11-part video series on how all vaccines are actually bad now, and she's releasing these episodes, percolation style, like drip drip once every now and again, and that's what gets traction. I see all of these MDs on Twitter constantly being like, okay guys, Candace released another one, we got to debunk it in a 27 tweet long thread now. Like that's kind of how it goes. I mean, so I'm not like trying to discourage you from making content, but I think it's just like, it's probably good to ascertain the reality of the platforms you're making the content on. Like, you're always going to be dwarfed by other dumb bullshit, but that's not a reason to not do what you do, right? You just have to be aware that like the audience that you want to reach is small, but they're there.
I disagree that the algorithm only favors one side, though. I think that people, hate watching is a thing on both sides. You have the Bernie rallies and the BLM stuff being pushed by the algorithms, just like you had two people that were searching for something else. So if someone's watching an anti-climate science conspiracy, then you have Climate Town being recommended to them in their algorithm too. So it's just hate watching goes both ways. I think there is data to show that the right-wing content is favored in general, but at the same time that there's still hate watching is still a thing on both sides. Hassan has tons of hate watchers, for example.
Oh yeah, of course. I think that actually kind of amplifies my argument in the sense that like, yeah, the algorithm might recommend them Hassan and they hate him, so they watch him, or they know of him anyways because they're a DGG fanboy or something, and so they go there just to make fun of his house or dox him or something. And at the end of the day, like, he's never going to win over those people because they were never there for actually like
I agree,
entertaining any new political ideas outside of what they already believe in the first place. They're there just to piss him off, watch him scream at a chat or yell how he's going to fuck their mom and then ban them. Like, that's generally how it goes. So, like the people you're pushing to captivate, if the algorithm recommends something you put out or something like another scientist content creator puts out, like, okay, good, like that is objectively a good thing. I think now we're dealing in probabilities where the likelihood of that happening for any individual person on the platform at any given time is lower relative to them being recommended some dumb bullshit from Daily Wire or PragerU or something like that.
Right. Like what's our ideal goal, right? Conspiracism is like rampant on these social media platforms, these content creation platforms. And to combat that, we have to put forward good information that's palatable to people. The unfortunate part is like good information is dry. It's not always doesn't have that theatricality that the conspiratorial content has. So like, how do we? What's that?
I disagree. I would like to go back to Dr. Bwinwin's point. It's about the story you tell. And
right.
If you can make it interesting, then people will listen.
I mean, my top videos right now on my YouTube channel, it's none of my try hard science stuff where I talk about the coolest papers that I've ever seen. It's me talking to an anti-vaxxer and someone that doesn't believe DNA is used for heredity. So it's like, I think, and that's genuine. Like, I think that's genuine. And I think you're, in those two examples, like, that's good faith. You're doing what is reasonable. And I think there's enough of a contrast between the interlocutors that it might loop some people in that wouldn't otherwise click like that. I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there certainly is value in the spectacle. Maybe I need to, like, I don't know, buy a luchador costume and wrestle with the lab leak hypothesis for like the 10th fucking time for another stream. Like, maybe we can certainly amp up the theatrics because there is still value, right? It's why every YouTube headline and title is clickbait. Like, that's why the science press is clickbaity as shit. You get people to click and try and amp up something that was otherwise incredibly boring and dry about how, we cured cancer, or you're gonna now be able to go to Mars soon or some shit.
Yeah, someone in chat raises a fair point that we're talking about, like, the people who are already captured by the conspiracism, that maybe we're casting the net in the wrong direction, and that capturing the indifference is a better stratagem.
Yeah, that's a big thing. Convert. There's a huge amount of people. I was really shocked, actually. I was watching. I had to record Haz's Twitch to get the video for my video and his cam for my video, and in the chat, there was a lot of, like, I would say like 5 or 6 messages that people were like, wow, I'm actually really surprised that this is this interesting. So I was like, dang, like that's good. Like I'm all right. Okay.
And like, whoa, this is way more enthralling than, watching someone scream in a Discord call for 16 hours.
Yeah. Or going to bio lecture, right? I mean, it's so funny. I mean, as a microbiologist, I hate the microbiology like the book. It's just so boring. I don't know. There's nothing in it. But when you put it in story and you put it in context and you look at the coolest things that are happening in that field, it's like, wow, now this stuff I can actually grasp. I can connect to. I mean, that's the whole point of my channel, hopefully.
Yeah.
Never mind. That.
Okay.
I was
Not bad.
just gonna say, there's a guy who has a physics channel I follow, and he makes physics so fucking interesting.
Nice.
That I watch all his videos because it's like, hey, I'm gonna stand over here on this wall and throw a, big ass ball that's made of steel to show you like how force works. Anyway.
Hell yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, the well-produced science videos, they're out there. It is, but it's hard. Like something like Climate Town, which is just an incredible channel all about climate science. I watch those videos, but I think there's no way that I could ever compete with that, right? I'm never going to have the production value. I'm never going to, they have a whole team of people, and there's a lot of really cool, really well-researched, well-edited videos. And I feel like, hey, that's just that already exists kind of thing. And,
Yeah.
and it's hard. It's hard to think about where, like me as a content creator and thinking of myself as that one. And then 2, thinking about like, who's going to watch my videos and why would someone watch my videos? And how am I going to make this stuff interesting? Because sometimes I've actually done a stream where I read a paper and I just read it and I was just like, this is really interesting. Wow, cool. And that was it. Like that, like for 30 minutes, I'm like, this is trash. Like, I don't even want to watch this. I don't even want to edit this anymore. So I just deleted it, and it's really hard to go from like a science idea to now it's this cool story and you have edits and you can't really do it in real time on a stream. So I don't know. I hopefully like, the idea of an actual scientist that's like streaming where people can come on, kind of like, I mean, what Marcus is doing too is really good. I think that's unique and different and rare. So hopefully, I don't know. There's a lot of different ideas, and this the debate idea is something that obviously I've thought about. I mean, obviously I watch debates and panels and all the time, but I don't know where a good science-based content creator goes and fits in with that. I don't really want to be in. I use my real name because I want to be professional. I want to act professionally on this platform, so I don't really want to get involved with with that whole like shouting and name calling and just content of the week idea.
Let's practice. Greg, you son of a bitch.
There you go. You're right. You're right.
I'm with you, Greg. I'm with you.
So it's like, what do I do? So I'm thinking maybe these interviews that I like, maybe not debate. It's a good term. Maybe like an interview is a better way of approaching ideas.
Yeah, and I kind of like, to bring poor Maddie, who we haven't seen in forever, kind of back into this. One, I think the reason, or not the reason, but like the circumstance in which I met her, of course, thanks to Read and Rap, she had just finished some panel on COVID vaccines or something in the typical, I think, hippy dippy sphere, which was just like certifiably insane. Everybody was saying things for the most part, save Maddie, that were so like conspiratorial that Maddie spent the entire panel not talking and just assembling a tinfoil hat with a roll of tinfoil and then wearing it. Like that's all she did. She didn't say anything. She just made a tinfoil hat for the looks. And it was a really good tinfoil hat, to give her credit. The artisanry was just chef's kiss. But immediately afterward, Reen Rap was like, hey, like there's an actual scientist here. If you want to talk to that, talk to them. And she was like, oh my God, yes, please. Like sanity, for the love of Christ.
Yeah.
Let me talk to him. So we talked for, I don't know, hour and a half afterwards, like hung out with her, chat and answered whatever COVID questions they had at that point in time. So yeah, there's absolutely value in doing that. So maybe like the strategy for how to set up the more educational, informational content would be, I guess, more like dialectic, like one-on-one conversations, perhaps with
think
other
that's the
people,
best.
maybe in the Twitch politics space, rather than shoehorning a scientist into a panel where the moderation sucks and everybody's shouting dumb bullshit. Like the last panel like that I was on, again, we had a post-debate about the quality of the moderation, and then some of the associates of some of the people I've talked to said a lot of unsavory things off stream, which I probably can't repeat because of terms of service towards me and about science in general. So that was certainly not good by any stretch of the imagination. So maybe that's just the strategy moving forward, is more like one-on-ones, debunkings, conversations, rather than throwing one of us into the lion's den, so to speak. But at the same time, depending on the subject, we might have to go into the lion's den. I think it just depends on the issue.
Yeah, I agree.
What's your thoughts, Bwin?
I was just thinking that hate watching Bernie's rallies is probably a better use of my time.
Hate watching Bernie's rallies.
I mean, think about that time that Bernie went on Fox News in the primaries, man. It was incredible. They filled that entire audience with all the right wing populists that they could, and Bernie won him over by the end of that crowd work, talking to people. It was incredible.
Mm.
The man is just made of policy.
Yeah, so like think about that, Greg. Like that was a controlled environment, right? Like imagine if there were no Fox News anchors, there were no moderators for that town hall. Imagine if it was, the hoggiest of hogs from left butt cheek Arkansas who were dragged into the Fox News studio to heckle whatever they wanted at Bernie. Like that is the equivalent in the real world political sphere of what happens in Twitch politics. So like if it's a structured, controlled conversation, yeah, I would be in favor of making an appearance if I was solicited. I think you would be too.
Yeah.
It's just we can't like reward or promote like the real bottom of the barrel shit where we're all just screaming and shouting conspiracy theories and borderline TOS material into the internet.
But don't you think I have the ability to say no to those panels because this isn't my job? Like if you're going to be a content creator for as your job, I feel like that your onus is you have to engage in those scenarios. I feel like for me, I hope I always want to be a scientist, and this is just kind of a part of my scientific outreach. That's kind of how I fit this whole hobby thing in my world. So I'm primarily a scientist doing this for scientific outreach. But if I was a content creator, then I have to get my face out everywhere. I have to say yes to every interview. I have to talk to everyone.
Yeah, 100%. Like the dumb bullshit is what is incentivized and what gets people the clicks, the views, the follows, the subs. Like that's why it's so popular in Twitch politics, because that's how the ecosystem works. Like absolutely, you're not wrong. It's nice that we have day jobs to fall back upon because we're not doing this out of a need for like the ability to imminently pay rent or something like that. Like we can do this safely and kind of engage where we want to because we have the ability to go back in our laboratories and work from 9 to 5.
I mean, technically, this kind of is my laboratory if I want it to be.
Yeah, it's true.
Ooh.
You're all in a study. You just don't know.
Hey, I mean, I was part of a clinical trial. I'm used to being a guinea pig, dog. You want to give me a vaccine? My arm's right here.
Speak for yourselves. This is my full-time gig.
Fourth shot today, so.
Hey, let's go! Congrats. We'll play the congratulations song
my
afterwards.
Dr. Homozygote told me that I should get it.
It was medical advice he gave.
Dr.
Hey,
MD.
Well, it's backed by Dr. Neuro, so
There you go.
actually someone who works for the CDC.
I'll blame him then.
Yeah, do that. Spare me the legal repercussions. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've been at this for 2.5 hours. Is there any other like post-show discussion we'd like to have? Any other topics that are really just bursting at the seams?
I think we've covered a fair amount today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Greg, I will also say, especially since we had Evo back out for the philosophy of science class, you should catch up on the reading so we can like resume that.
Yeah. I was just feeling sick, so couldn't make it. I apologize. but
no, it's fine. I'm just saying, like, eventually when we can all make it again,
Yeah.
just because we're down one for conversation reasons.
Yeah, I mean, we've only got 2 sessions left, and if we don't get to the last one, we're never going to find the answer.
there you go.
Oh shit.
True.
Yeah, it's a big issue. It's a big problem.
Good.
So you'll never figure out how to tell your story of science without these last 2 sessions, man.
I always enjoy those conversations, so thank you for the invite.
Hell yeah.
Alrighty. Yeah, let's go ahead and go around, do shout outs, plugs. Dr. Bunawin, you're actually first on my screen, so we'll start with you.
All right, so I'm Dr. Bunawin. I don't have enough subs on Twitch, so you can help me out with that. And I stream in the mornings, Tuesday through Friday, usually talking about something philosophical or ethics related. This week we've been working on feminist ethics, and we did some environmental ethics today. And and then on Sunday we host the Philosophy of Science seminar. And like I said, 2 more sessions left, hopefully these next 2 Sundays. And we can free everybody up for their end of semester crunch, because all those academics have the end of semester crunch. And so, yeah, come by and visit. It's a nice time, cool place to hang out in the morning, get your brain kick-started to think about things, about your life for the rest of the day and the week and stuff like that. So, yeah.
And you have cool.
That's what I do. And, yeah, I do have some pretty cool emotes.
Agreed. Greg, you're next.
I'm Greg. I have a YouTube channel. You can go there by the URL is thepeer.review. I have science content. I also debate communists about the existence of DNA. So that's what I do.
Hey,
that's what I do.
it's a dirty job. It's a dirty job.
So I just put out a video about nuclear power, and it was an interesting piece in Slate about like the futures in 2070, looking back at what we could have done differently, and it was an interesting piece. So check it out. Thank you.
Gremlo, you're next.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitch and all the social media platforms at Grimlo. We have the first gathering of the Tracksuit Mafia happening tomorrow. Going to be a leftist panel talking about a variety of topics. And I also have, this is kind of the first time I've announced it on a group thing, but we have another 24-hour charity stream coming up on April 16th. We're going to be raising money for the Innocence Project, having a bunch of other streamers on to talk about incarceration and policing in America, and hopefully doing some gaming and having some fun and, putting my body in harm's way for a good cause again. So check it out.
Sounds good. Professor Q, go ahead.
Professor Q. You can't find me anywhere but here, just the way I like it. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the University of Missouri for now. Yeah, that's me. Perfect.
I'll go ahead and round it out. And I think most of you know who I am. Twitch.tv/homozygote. I'm not going to make the spelling joke. I make it every time, and it's probably boring by now. Yeah, I think most of my stuff is still COVID right now. Pretty salient topic, but again, we have Ministry of Science every Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, and then we have at least me participating in Dr. Bunawin's Philosophy of Science seminar Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern. So if you like me in any capacity, you should also go check out that class because it's good stuff. I guarantee it. You'll actually learn something and not doubt the existence of DNA for no reason. So on that note, we could probably go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you all again for your time. It's always appreciated. Always good conversation with all of you folks.
Thanks, guys.
And hopefully we'll see Amber again because she got a tattoo this week, so she couldn't be here. So we might see her next week.
DNA-based tattoo.
Ooh.
It's pretty DNA Amber of her.
Yeah, living up to the name.
DNA. Wait, a DNA-based okay, I'm sorry. My brain just totally. Okay.
That's what he's posting.
Dude.
In the chat.
That'd be cool to put
Yeah,
some
there's a
nucleotides
picture of it in the ministry chat.
Put some DNTPs in the ink, and then you kind of like, oh, that'd be sick.
Oh, dude. Oh, that's such a cool idea, actually.
right, guys.
that was dangerous, Greg. You shouldn't have said that. Now I'm thinking and scheming.
At 50 subs, we're going to.
There you go. There you go.
Oh yeah, the follower and sub goal, DNTP based tattoo. Dude, I could take them from my laboratory. That's the scary part. I could actually do that. But anyways, subject for another time. Thank you all again for being here, and I'll let you all go on your merry way.
All right, man. Have a
All
good
right.
stream. Peace.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, that was it. I did it. Hope you guys had fun. Thanks for watching. Peace.